A 4-year-old girl stood alone in the middle of a frozen highway at midnight, wearing a coat too thin for the killing cold, holding a stuffed rabbit against her chest like it was the last warm thing left in the world. Snow buried the road in every direction. No headlights, no sirens, no one coming. She had been standing there for almost 2 hours, and when the first engine broke through the storm, a black Harley ridden by a man covered in scars and outlaw leather, she didn't scream. She didn't run. She looked up at the biker with enormous brown eyes and whispered 5 words that would destroy him. "Did Mommy send you?" Around her neck hung a silver pendant that belonged to a dead woman, except the woman wasn't dead. She was running, and the men chasing her had just crossed the county line. If this story doesn't grip you by the throat and refuse to let go, nothing will. Stay until the very end. I promise it's worth every second. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from right now, and let's ride. The storm dropped 6 inches of snow on Black Hollow County between noon and nightfall. By 7 o'clock, Route 9 was a white coffin lid stretching 40 miles through frozen timber country with no guardrails, no streetlights, and no reason for any living thing to be on it. The gas stations along the corridor locked their pumps early. The volunteer fire department sent out an automated warning to every phone in the county. Stay home, stay warm, stay alive. The plows wouldn't run until morning. Colt Mercer heard the warning ping on his phone while he was already 20 miles deep into the storm on a matte black Harley Road King that sounded like the earth was splitting beneath him. He glanced at the screen, then shoved the phone back into his jacket. Warnings didn't apply to men like him. Very little did anymore. At 42 years old, Colt rode with the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club out of a converted feed mill on the south edge of Black Hollow. Patched member for 14 years. Vice president for 5. A man built from silence and scar tissue, with hands that could rebuild a transmission blindfolded, and a reputation that made county deputies cross the street when they saw him coming. He wasn't the biggest man in the club. He wasn't the loudest. But when Colt Mercer walked into a room, something shifted in the air pressure that made people either sit down or leave. He preferred the cold, preferred the empty roads and the sound of wind cutting through his helmet visor, because it drowned out everything else. The memories, the questions, the face he still saw every time he closed his eyes. 5 years of riding alone through storms exactly like this one had taught him that the road didn't heal anything. It just postponed the bleeding. His headlight cut a weak tunnel through the whiteout. Visibility was maybe 40 feet. The engine vibrated through his thighs and forearms, and the temperature had dropped below 15 degrees. His fingers were going numb inside his gloves despite the heated grips. Every rational instinct told him to pull over, find shelter, wait it out. But rational instinct had abandoned Colt Mercer a long time ago, and what replaced it was something closer to punishment. He rode because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering Claire. The child appeared so suddenly that his brain refused to process it. 1 second the road was empty, white, nothing. The next, a small figure materialized directly in his headlight beam like a ghost stepping out of the storm. Tiny. Still. Standing dead center on the highway's faded yellow line, as if someone had placed her there on purpose and walked away. Colt locked the rear brake and felt the back tire slide sideways across black ice. The Harley fishtailed violently. He threw his weight left, dragged his boot across frozen pavement, and the bike shuddered to a stop at an ugly angle less than 15 feet from her. The engine idled. Snow swirled between them. The little girl didn't move. She wore a purple coat so thin it might as well have been paper. Mismatched boots, one brown, one black, neither the right size. A stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest with both arms like she was trying to keep it alive. Her lips were blue. Her skin had gone past white into something translucent and wrong. Colt killed the engine. The silence hit like a wall. He pulled off his helmet and stepped toward her slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal. His boots crunched through ice crust. Wind screamed across the open highway. "Hey," he said. His voice came out rough, cracked from cold and disuse. "Hey, sweetheart, you okay?" She stared at him. Those brown eyes were enormous in her small face, too alert, too steady for a child that young. She should have been screaming, should have been hysterical. Instead, she studied him with an expression that belonged on someone who had already learned that the world was not a safe place. "Did Mommy send you?" she asked. The words were barely audible above the wind, but they hit Colt somewhere behind his ribs like a fist. He dropped to one knee in the snow. The cold soaked immediately through his jeans. "Nobody sent me, kid. I'm just—" He stopped, swallowed, tried again. "What's your name? Where's your mom?" "Rosie," she said. Then she pointed behind her into the white void east of the highway. "Mommy's car went in the ditch. She told me to stand right here and not move. She said someone would come." The child's voice was thin and mechanical, the way children speak when they're repeating instructions they've memorized to keep from falling apart. "She said don't move no matter what." Colt looked east, nothing but darkness and blowing snow. The river pass was out there somewhere, a narrow stretch where Route 9 skirted the edge of a 30-foot embankment above frozen water. If a car went off the road there, you wouldn't see it from the highway. You wouldn't hear anything. You'd just vanish. "How long ago?" he asked. Rosie clutched the rabbit tighter. "A long time." He pulled out his phone. One bar of signal flickered and died. He tried again. Nothing. Colt unzipped his leather jacket, the heavy one, lined with wool, the one that still smelled like engine oil and cold iron, and wrapped it around the child without thinking. It swallowed her completely. Only her face and the rabbit's ears poked out from the collar. "Okay, Rosie, I'm going to pick you up now. That all right?" She nodded once. When he lifted her, she weighed almost nothing. Her body was rigid with cold, trembling in small, exhausted waves that she seemed to be trying to hide. She pressed her face into his shoulder and the stuffed rabbit's ear brushed against his neck. That's when he saw it. A silver chain around her throat, thin and delicate against her frozen skin. And hanging from it, a small pendant shaped like an angel with folded wings. The metal caught the faint glow from his bike's parking light, and something inside Colt Mercer cracked wide open. He knew that necklace. He knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. He'd bought it 11 years ago from a pawn shop in Reno. A $20 pendant on a cheap chain that he'd given to a woman sitting on the tailgate of his truck at 2 a.m, because she said she'd never owned anything silver. She wore it every single day after that. It was around her neck the last time he ever saw her. It was the detail that haunted his sleep more than her face, more than her voice, more than the way she laughed, because that little silver angel was the only proof that what they had was real, and when she vanished, it vanished with her. Claire Bennett. The only woman Colt Mercer had ever loved. The woman who disappeared 5 years ago without a word, without a warning, without a body. The woman the Iron Saint spent 7 months searching for across 4 states before every lead went cold and every door slammed shut and the world simply swallowed her whole. Colt stood in the blizzard holding a child who wore a dead woman's necklace and felt the ground beneath him turn to nothing. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold. He carried Rosie to an abandoned bus shelter 50 yards off the highway. A concrete rectangle with a rusted bench and no door, but it blocked the wind. He set her down carefully, kept the jacket wrapped tight around her, and dug through his saddlebag for the emergency blanket he kept rolled behind his toolkit. It was thin. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough. "Rosie," his voice sounded foreign to him. "That necklace you're wearing, where did you get it?" She touched it through the leather jacket's collar. "Mommy gave it to me. She said it keeps people safe." "Your mommy, what's her name?" Rosie looked confused by the question, the way all small children do when someone asks them something they've never had to articulate. "Mommy," she said simply. Colt's jaw tightened so hard his teeth ached. He tried the phone again. This time, a single bar held for 3 seconds. Enough. He punched the emergency number for the Iron Saints clubhouse. Not 911, not the sheriff, but the direct line to the one place on Earth where he knew someone would answer and someone would come no matter what. Big Noah Pike picked up on the second ring. "Grizzly," Colt said, "Route 9, mile marker 41. I've got a child, alone, hypothermic. Her mother's vehicle went off the road near the river pass. I need bodies out here now." No questions, no hesitation. The line went dead. That was the thing about the Iron Saints that no newspaper article or sheriff's report would ever capture. These men, tattooed, scarred, carrying records and reputations that made polite society recoil, operated on a frequency that most people couldn't hear. When the call came, they came. It didn't matter if the roads were impassable. It didn't matter if the storm was trying to kill everything that moved. Noah Pike would make 3 phone calls, and within 20 minutes, motorcycles would be cutting through the blizzard like wolves running in formation because a brother said a child was in danger, and that was the only information anyone needed. Colt sat down on the frozen bench beside Rosie. The cold concrete burned through his jeans. Without his jacket, the wind sliced through his flannel shirt and thermal layer like they were tissue paper. He could feel his core temperature dropping. It didn't matter. Rosie leaned into his side. The rabbit stared at him with one remaining button eye. "Are you a bad guy?" she asked. Colt almost laughed. Almost. "Depends who you ask. Mommy says bad guys wear suits." Something sharp and aching expanded behind his sternum. He looked down at this tiny, half-frozen child who should have been dead by now, who had stood alone on a highway in a killing storm because her mother told her to stay, and she simply obeyed. And he recognized something in her face that made his blood go cold in a way the weather never could. She had Claire's eyes. Not similar, not resembling. Exact. The same deep brown with flecks of amber near the iris, the same stubborn downward tilt at the corners, the same way they narrowed slightly when she was thinking. And the chin, that squared-off, defiant chin that Claire used to jut forward when she argued with him about politics or engine timing or whose turn it was to drive. Colt looked away, stared at the wall, breathed. The math was simple and devastating. If Claire had been pregnant when she disappeared 5 years ago, this child would be exactly the right age. 4 years old. Maybe just turned 4. Conceived during those final weeks when everything was falling apart, and Claire was gathering evidence and the world was closing in, and they spent every night together because neither of them could sleep alone anymore. He shut the thought down. Locked it in a box, shoved it so deep that it couldn't touch him. Not now, not while there was a child to keep alive, and a mother somewhere out in the dark, who might already be dead. Engines broke through the storm 12 minutes later. The sound was unmistakable. Multiple Harleys running hard through snow, their exhaust notes blending into something primal and rhythmic that vibrated through the ground before the headlights appeared. 4 bikes materialized out of the whiteout and pulled up to the bus shelter in a staggered line. Big Noah Grizzly Pike arrived first. 6'4", 260 pounds, a red beard frozen white at the tips, hands like catcher's mitts. Former Army combat engineer who did 2 tours in Afghanistan and came home with a titanium plate in his skull and a permanent inability to sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch. He dismounted without cutting his engine and crossed the snow in 4 strides. Behind him came Rico Torres, lean, wiry, quick-eyed, the club's road captain. A man who could read a highway map the way musicians read sheet music. He carried bolt cutters on his back and a first aid kit strapped to his tank bag. Mason Creed rolled in third, the quietest man in the Iron Saints, which was saying something in a club built on silence. Mason had a face full of knife scars and the steadiest hands Colt had ever seen on a human being. Former Navy corpsman. He could field dress a wound in a thunderstorm without blinking. Deke Holloway came last, fishtailing slightly on the ice, his bike loaded with blankets and a portable propane heater he'd grabbed from the clubhouse. Deke was the youngest patched member, 31, built like a middleweight fighter, with the kind of restless energy that made him dangerous in confined spaces and invaluable in a crisis. They gathered around the bus shelter, 4 massive men in black leather, snow-crusted on their shoulders and helmets, breath coming in white clouds that the wind ripped apart instantly. They looked like exactly what the world accused them of being: outlaws, criminals, men who lived outside the boundaries of decent society. Then they saw Rosie, and something shifted. Grizzly crouched down until he was eye level with the child. His enormous frame blocked the wind completely. His voice dropped to something so gentle it barely qualified as sound. "Hey there, little bit. You cold?" Rosie nodded. "Well, that ain't gonna work," he said. He unwound the scarf from his neck, thick wool military surplus stinking of cigar smoke, and wrapped it around her so carefully that his massive fingers barely touched her skin. "That's better. That rabbit cold too?" Rosie held up the stuffed animal. Grizzly examined it with complete seriousness. "Yep, definitely cold. Rico, you got another blanket for this rabbit?" Rico was already pulling thermal wraps from his kit. Rabbit gets the good stuff, he said, tearing open a heat pack and pressing it against the stuffed animal's chest before wrapping both in a mylar sheet. He handed the bundle back to Rosie. She almost smiled. Mason Creed was already on the phone with County Dispatch, relaying coordinates for the vehicle off the road near the river pass. His voice was flat and clinical, the medic's voice, the one that stripped emotion out of communication, because emotion wasted time and time was the only currency that mattered when someone was dying in the cold. Deke fired up the propane heater inside the shelter. Warm air pushed against the frozen walls, and the temperature climbed from lethal to merely brutal within minutes. Colt stood apart from the others. He hadn't spoken since they arrived. Grizzly noticed. He always noticed. The big man rose from his crouch beside Rosie and walked over to Colt, reading his face with the practiced fluency of a man who had known him for 15 years. "What?" Grizzly said quietly. Colt's jaw worked. No sound came out. Grizzly waited. Snow accumulated on his shoulders. "Look at her neck," Colt finally said. Grizzly turned, looked at the child, looked at the thin silver chain visible above the scarf, looked at the pendant. His entire body went rigid. "That's not possible," Grizzly whispered. "I know." "Colt, I know what it is." Grizzly stared at the necklace for a long time. His expression cycled through recognition, confusion, and something close to dread before landing on the only emotion that made sense for a man who had spent 7 months watching his best friend tear himself apart, searching for a ghost. "Her mother," Grizzly said. "Where's her mother?" "Somewhere off the river pass. SUV in the embankment." "You think?" "I don't think anything yet." Colt's voice was a blade. "Get the kid warm. Get search and rescue to the river. Find whoever's in that vehicle." Rico was watching them. He'd seen the necklace too. His face had gone pale beneath the road grime and cold. Mason looked up from the phone. His eyes traveled from Colt to Rosie to the pendant and back. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Every man standing in that shelter had been in the clubhouse the night Colt came back from searching for Claire for the last time. 3 a.m, soaked in rain, hands bleeding from tearing apart an abandoned warehouse on a false tip. He walked through the door, sat down at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and stared at the wall for 6 hours without speaking. Nobody asked if he was okay. Nobody offered comfort. They just sat with him. Because that's what the Brotherhood did when words were useless, and presence was the only thing that kept a man from going under. Now they stood in a frozen bus shelter looking at a 4-year-old wearing that same ghost necklace, and the silence between them carried the weight of everything they'd watched Colt endure. Sheriff Wade Harper arrived 23 minutes later in a county SUV with chains on the tires and blue lights cutting through the snow. He stepped out wearing a department-issue parka and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in years. Harper was 58 years old, built like a fence post, with deep-set eyes that gave nothing away, and a voice worn down to gravel by 3 decades of working a county where bad things happen to good people with mechanical regularity. He had a complicated relationship with the Iron Saints. He arrested them when the law demanded it, and left them alone when the law couldn't reach the places they could. An uneasy détente built on mutual necessity and the shared understanding that Black Hollow County existed in a gap between civilization and something older. "Mercer," Harper said, approaching the shelter. His breath came in short, controlled bursts. "Dispatch says you found a child on the highway. 4 years old, name's Rosie. Mother's vehicle went off the road somewhere near the river pass. She's been out here at least 2 hours. Harper looked at the child. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes flickered, a micro-reaction so brief that only someone watching for it would have caught it. Colt caught it. "I'll get search teams on the river pass," Harper said too quickly. "You all should get that child to the medical center." "Already in progress," Mason said from behind them. "County EMS is en route, 8 minutes. Harper nodded. He looked at Rosie again. That same flicker. Colt stepped closer, lowered his voice. "You know something." "I know there's a child in a blizzard who needs a hospital," Harper said evenly. "That's what I know right now." "That's not what I asked." Harper met Colt's eyes. For 3 seconds, something enormous and terrible passed between them, an unspoken transmission loaded with history and implication that neither man was willing to decode in front of the others. Then Harper turned and walked back to his vehicle. Colt watched him go. The sheriff's shoulders were too stiff, his stride too deliberate. The way he'd looked at Rosie's face, not with the professional concern of a first responder assessing a victim, but with the horrified recognition of a man seeing something he never expected to see again. Harper knew something. Something he'd been carrying for a long time. The ambulance arrived. Paramedics loaded Rosie onto a stretcher, wrapped her in heated blankets, started a small IV in her tiny arm. She didn't cry. She held the stuffed rabbit and watched everything with those enormous brown eyes, Claire's eyes. And when the ambulance doors began to close, she looked directly at Colt. "Are you coming?" she asked. Every man in that bus shelter felt the question land. "Yeah," Colt said. "I'm coming." He climbed into the ambulance. The doors shut. The vehicle pulled onto the frozen highway and disappeared into the storm. Grizzly stood in the silence that followed, snow melting in his beard, staring at the tracks the ambulance left in the white. "Rico," he said quietly. "Yeah." "Call everyone. Full roster. Nobody sleeps tonight." "What do I tell them?" Grizzly's massive hands curled into fists at his sides. "Tell them Colt found something on the road. Tell them it's connected to Claire Bennett. And tell them the sheriff knows more than he's saying." Rico pulled out his phone. His hands were steady. His voice was not. 20 miles east, buried under 3 feet of snow at the bottom of a frozen embankment, a woman sat behind the wheel of a wrecked SUV with blood running down her temple and a loaded pistol in her lap. She was conscious. She was watching the tree line through a shattered windshield. Every few seconds, she glanced at the rearview mirror, not checking behind her on the road, but scanning for headlights approaching from the direction she'd come. She had been running for 21 days. 3 weeks of switching motels at midnight, paying cash, changing license plates in truck stop parking lots, driving back roads through states she'd never seen before, with a 4-year-old sleeping in the back seat clutching a rabbit, and asking every morning, "Are we going home today, Mommy?" The people hunting her weren't coming to ask questions. They were coming to make sure she never answered any. The pistol in her lap had 7 rounds. She had fired guns exactly 3 times in her life, all within the last year. Her hands shook against the grip. Her vision kept blurring from the head wound. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones like something alive and hungry. But she was still breathing, and Rosie was on the highway. And someone would find her daughter because the world owed her at least that much. The woman's name was not the one on her driver's license. It was not the name on the lease of the apartment she'd abandoned in New Mexico, or the name on the school enrollment forms she'd filled out for Rosie, or the name on the bank account that held $1,100 she'd withdrawn before running. Her real name was Claire Bennett, and the last person she expected to find her daughter on a frozen highway in Black Hollow County was the man she'd loved, the man she'd abandoned, the man she'd been forbidden to contact for 5 years because the people she'd helped put in prison would have killed him and everyone he knew. But the world has a vicious sense of timing, because the men she was running from, the ones with money and connections and the patience to hunt a ghost across state lines, had already crossed into Black Hollow County 40 minutes ago. 3 black SUVs. No plates. Moving fast through the storm. And they weren't just coming for Claire. They were coming for the child. The ambulance hit a patch of black ice 2 miles from Black Hollow Medical Center and slid sideways for a full 3 seconds before the driver corrected. Inside, Rosie didn't flinch. She lay on the stretcher beneath heated blankets with the stuffed rabbit pressed against her chin and her eyes locked on Colt Mercer sitting across from her on the metal bench, his elbows on his knees, his flannel shirt soaked through with melted snow, his body shaking from cold he refused to acknowledge. The paramedic, a young woman with red hair pulled back tight and hands that moved with efficient, practiced calm, checked Rosie's vitals for the 3rd time and spoke without looking up. "Core temp's 94.2. She's lucky. Another 30 minutes out there and we'd be having a different conversation." Colt said nothing. He was staring at the pendant around Rosie's neck. The silver angel caught the ambulance's harsh fluorescent light every time the vehicle rocked, throwing tiny reflections across the ceiling like something trying to signal from very far away. "Sir, are you her father?" The question hit him in the sternum. He looked at the paramedic, looked at Rosie, looked at the necklace. "I don't know," he said. The paramedic's expression shifted slightly. Not judgment, just recalibration. She returned to her work. Rosie's small hand emerged from beneath the blanket and reached toward him. Her fingers were still cold. He took them without thinking, and her grip tightened with surprising force for someone who weighed less than a bag of concrete mix. "Mr. Coat," she said quietly. "What?" "Your coat is warm." She was still wearing his leather jacket underneath the blankets. The thing was so large on her it looked like she'd been swallowed by an animal. "Keep it," he said. The ambulance pulled into the emergency bay at Black Hollow Medical Center at 9:47 p.m. The hospital was a squat, underfunded brick building that served a county of 11,000 people with 12 beds, one surgeon, and a staff held together by stubbornness and federal subsidies that arrived late every quarter. The emergency department had 3 bays separated by curtains that didn't fully close, and a waiting room with chairs bolted to the floor because someone had thrown one through the window during a meth-related incident 2 years ago. They brought Rosie inside. Warm air hit Colt's wet clothes and turned his skin into a battlefield of pins and needles. A nurse tried to direct him to the waiting room. He didn't move. He stood outside the curtain where they were working on Rosie and listened to every sound, the beep of the monitor, the rustle of blankets, Rosie's voice asking if her rabbit could have a blanket too. His phone buzzed. Grizzly. "Talk to me," Colt said. Search teams found the vehicle. SUV rolled down the embankment about a quarter-mile past the river bridge. Driver's still inside. Alive. They're extracting now. "How bad?" "Head wound, possible broken ribs. Conscious, but not cooperating. She won't let the paramedics near her until they confirm her daughter's safe. Rico's relaying from the scene." Colt closed his eyes, pressed his forehead against the cold hospital wall. "What else?" Grizzly paused. The silence on the line had weight. "She's got a gun, Colt. Loaded pistol in her lap. Wouldn't put it down. Took the paramedics 10 minutes to talk her into releasing it. Whatever she's running from, she expected it to find her before we did." "It will," Colt said. "Get to the hospital. Bring everyone." "Already rolling. And Colt, what?" "Harper's acting wrong. He left the bus shelter before the search team even confirmed the vehicle location. Took off toward the East County Road like he knew exactly where he was going." Rico watched him. "He didn't need directions, brother. He drove straight to her." The line went dead. Colt stood in the fluorescent hallway of Black Hollow Medical Center and felt something inside him rearrange, the grief and confusion and desperate hope compressing into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous. Harper knew. The sheriff of Black Hollow County, the man who stood beside Colt at the memorial they'd held for Claire when the search was finally abandoned, the man who put his hand on Colt's shoulder and said, "Sometimes people just disappear, Mercer. It's nobody's fault." That man had known where Claire was the entire time. 5 years. 5 years of Colt ripping apart his own life searching. 5 years of dead ends and false leads, and nights so black he'd sit on his bike in the clubhouse parking lot at 3 a.m. with the engine off, staring at nothing, trying to construct a reason to keep breathing. 5 years of the brothers watching him deteriorate and saying nothing because the only woman who could have stopped it was gone, and the only man who knew the truth was wearing a badge and lying to his face. Colt's hands were shaking again. This time it had nothing to do with the cold. 40 minutes later, the second ambulance arrived. Colt heard it before he saw it. The diesel whine of the engine, the brief burst of siren as it pulled into the bay, the organized chaos of paramedics moving fast. He walked to the emergency entrance and stood just inside the automatic doors while they unloaded the stretcher. She was wrapped in thermal blankets and strapped down with a cervical collar stabilizing her neck. Her face was swollen on the left side, the skin around her eye already turning purple-black. Blood had dried in a dark line from her hairline to her jaw. An IV ran into her right arm. Her lips were moving. She was saying something to the paramedic jogging alongside the stretcher, but Colt couldn't hear the words. Then the stretcher passed under the entrance lights, and he saw her, older, thinner. The angles of her face sharper than he remembered, as if the last 5 years had carved away everything soft and left only bone and determination. Her hair was shorter, shoulder length, darker than before, probably dyed. Her hands gripped the stretcher rails with white-knuckle force despite the restraints, and even in the harsh hospital light, Even through the bruises and blood and exhaustion, she was unmistakably, impossibly, devastatingly Claire Bennett. She turned her head as the stretcher moved through the corridor. Their eyes met. The recognition was instantaneous. Her face went through 4 emotions in less than a second: shock, terror, grief, and something so raw and unguarded that it looked like it physically hurt her. Her mouth opened. Her eyes filled. "Colt." The word came out broken, barely a whisper above the noise of the emergency department. "They found us." Then her eyes rolled back and she went limp on the stretcher. The paramedics rushed her past him. A nurse shouted for the on-call physician. Someone pushed Colt aside, gently, professionally, and the curtain closed between them. He stood in the hallway. He didn't move for a very long time. The Iron Saints filled the waiting room like an occupying force. Grizzly arrived first, followed by Mason and Deke. Rico pulled in 20 minutes later, his face tight and windburned from riding back from the crash site. They took over the corner nearest the emergency department entrance without discussion. 4 large men in leather and boots spreading across plastic chairs designed for people half their size, dripping snowmelt onto the linoleum floor. The overhead fluorescents hummed. A vending machine in the corner rattled every few minutes with the mechanical desperation of a thing trying to keep itself alive. Nobody spoke for the first hour. Mason cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife. Deke paced between the vending machine and the window, his boots making a rhythmic thud-thud-thud on the tile that sounded like a countdown. Rico sat perfectly still with his arms crossed and his eyes tracking every person who walked through the department: nurses, doctors, a janitor pushing a mop bucket, a drunk with a cut on his forehead waiting for stitches. Cataloging. Assessing. The road captain's brain never stopped mapping threats and exits. Grizzly sat beside Colt. Neither man looked at the other. They stared at the far wall where a faded poster about hand hygiene was peeling at the corners. "You need dry clothes," Grizzly said. "No." "You're going to get hypothermic sitting in wet." "I said no." Silence. The clock on the wall ticked past 11. A doctor emerged from behind the curtain and spoke to the charge nurse in a voice too low to overhear. Colt watched them. The doctor glanced in his direction, then disappeared again. "She's alive," Grizzly said. Not a question. "She's alive." "How long you think Harper knew?" Colt's jaw muscles flexed. "Long enough." Grizzly exhaled slowly through his nose. The sound was steady and controlled, the breathing of a man managing something volatile inside himself. "You know what that means?" "It means the sheriff of this county let me believe the woman I loved was dead for 5 years, while he knew exactly where she was and chose to say nothing. It means every time I sat across from him in that office asking for updates on a missing person case, he was lying. It means every time he told me to let it go, move on, accept that she was gone, he was protecting a secret that was never his to keep. Or protecting her. The words hung in the air between them like a blade suspended by a thread. Colt turned his head slowly and looked at Grizzly. "Don't." "I'm not defending him. I'm saying if she was in witness protection, then someone should have told me. Would you have stayed away?" The question was quiet and devastating. Grizzly asked it without accusation, without judgment, just the simple, terrible honesty of a man who knew his brother well enough to understand that the answer was no. Colt Mercer would not have stayed away. Colt Mercer would have burned through every barrier, every federal protocol, every protective order on earth to reach her, and in doing so, he might have led the exact people hunting her straight to her door. Colt didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew. "That doesn't make it right," Colt said finally. "No," Grizzly agreed. "It doesn't." At midnight, a young doctor with dark circles under his eyes and a stethoscope draped over his shoulder like a dead snake came through the curtain and asked for the family of the woman in Bay 2. Colt stood up. "She's stable," the doctor said. "Concussion, 2 cracked ribs, multiple contusions, moderate hypothermia. She's conscious now and asking about her daughter. She's also—" He paused, choosing his words with visible care. "She's requesting that no one contact law enforcement about her identity." "Why?" Colt asked. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "That's between her and whatever situation she's in. I'm telling you because she specifically asked if the man in the leather jacket was still here, And when I said yes, she became extremely agitated. She wants to see you, but I need to be clear. My patient is fragile, both physically and psychologically. Whatever's happening here, she's terrified. Not anxious, not nervous. Terrified in a way I've seen exactly twice in my career, and both times involved people running from situations where their lives were in immediate danger. I understand, Colt said. Do you? Because the last thing she needs right now is, I said I understand. The doctor studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. Colt walked through the curtain. Claire was sitting partially upright on the hospital bed with pillows propped behind her and an IV drip running into her left arm. The cervical collar was off. A white bandage covered the wound on her temple. Her face was a map of exhaustion, the kind that went beyond physical fatigue into something structural, as if the architecture holding her together had been failing for years and was now visibly cracking. She looked at Colt. He looked at her. 5 years collapsed into nothing. Every mile he'd driven searching for her, every door he'd kicked in, every night he'd spent staring at the ceiling of his room above the clubhouse with the pendant's absence burning a hole in his chest, all of it compressed into the space between them, which was approximately 8 feet of hospital floor and an infinity of unspoken things. Before you say anything, Claire said. Her voice was hoarse, cracked, barely above a whisper. I need you to know that I didn't choose this. You didn't choose to disappear without a word. No. You didn't choose to let me spend 5 years thinking you were dead. No. You didn't choose to have my daughter and never tell me she existed. Claire's face crumbled. The composure she'd been holding together by sheer will fractured along every line. Tears ran down her bruised cheeks, and she pressed both hands over her mouth as if trying to physically hold herself together. How did you? She has your eyes, Colt said. She has my chin, and she's wearing the necklace I gave you in Reno, which means you kept it, which means whatever you're about to tell me about why you left, it wasn't because you stopped. He broke off. His voice had cracked on the last word, and he needed a moment to put it back together. She's mine. Yes. The word was so small it barely existed. Colt's legs went weak. He sat down in the plastic chair beside the bed. Not gently, not deliberately, but the way a man sits when his body simply stops supporting him. He put his elbows on his knees and pressed his fists against his forehead and breathed. I was already 6 weeks along when I left, Claire said. I didn't know. I swear to you, Colt, I didn't know until I was already relocated. By then it was too late. Contacting you would have what? Killed you. Her voice hardened through the tears, and underneath the grief was something fierce and unyielding. The people I helped expose, they had federal agents on payroll. They had access to witness protection databases. 2 informants were murdered in the first year after the arrests. One of them was found in his bathtub with his throat cut 3 days after a U.S. Marshal's office was breached. If I had contacted you, if I had sent one message, one letter, one signal of any kind, they would have traced it. And they wouldn't have come for me first. They would have come for you, for Noah, for every person connected to me who helped gather that evidence. So you let me die slowly instead. Claire flinched. The words hit her like a physical blow, and she turned her face away, staring at the wall where the heart monitor beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. Yes, she whispered. I let you die slowly, because the alternative was letting you die fast. Silence filled the space between them. The monitor beeped. The IV dripped. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang 3 times and stopped. Harper coordinated it, Claire said. He's the one who connected me with the federal marshals. He's the one who built the new identity. He made me promise... Her voice broke again. He made me promise never to come back. He said if I loved you, I'd stay gone. And I hated him for it every single day. But he wasn't wrong. He had no right. He had every right. He was trying to protect you. He could have told me. And what would you have done? The question echoed what Grizzly had asked in the waiting room, and it carried the same devastating implication. Colt stared at the floor between his boots. The linoleum was scuffed and stained. He counted the marks while his mind processed something it didn't want to accept. That the people who had hurt him the most, Claire, Harper, the entire machinery of silence that had stolen 5 years of his life, Might have done it because they knew him well enough to understand that his love was a weapon that pointed in every direction, including at the people he was trying to protect. He raised his head. What happened 3 weeks ago? Claire's expression changed. The grief hardened into something tactical, survival mode, the face of a woman who had been running long enough to understand that emotion was a luxury afforded only to people who weren't being hunted. Someone found us. I don't know how. Maybe the database was compromised again. Maybe one of the old network contacts recognized me. Maybe I just got careless. But 3 weeks ago, a man showed up at Rosie's school. He didn't approach her. He just stood across the street and watched, took photos. When I picked her up that afternoon, he was gone, but I found a note on my car. What did it say? One word, my real name, Claire. Colt's fist tightened on his knees. I called the marshal assigned to my case. He told me to stay put, that they'd send someone. Nobody came. I called again the next day. The number was disconnected. I drove past the regional marshal's office. It was closed, not temporarily, permanently. Budget cuts, the sign said. My entire protection infrastructure just evaporated. So you ran. What else could I do? I grabbed Rosie, emptied the bank account, and drove. No plan, no destination. Just movement. I changed motels every night, paid cash, switched plates when I could. But they were always behind me. One day, sometimes half a day. I'd pull into a gas station and see the same black SUV from 3 towns ago parked across the street. They were hurting me, letting me run just far enough to think I was free, then appearing again to remind me I wasn't. And you came here. Not on purpose. The storm forced me off the highway. I was trying to get north, Canada, maybe. I don't know. I wasn't thinking clearly anymore. Rosie was sick. I hadn't slept in 4 days. And then the car went off the road and everything. She stopped, drew a breath that shuddered through her cracked ribs. I put Rosie on the highway because it was the only place someone might find her. I told her to stand still and wait. And then I sat in that car with a gun in my lap and waited to see who came first, someone who would save her or someone who would take her. Colt stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. How many? He said. How many what? How many are coming? Claire's eyes met his. In them, he saw the full scope of what she'd been carrying alone for 3 weeks. The sleepless nights, the constant motion, the animal terror of a mother protecting her young with nothing but a second-hand pistol, and the desperate mathematics of survival. 3 vehicles, she said. At least 8 men. They're professionals, Colt, not street level. These are people with resources, military training, surveillance equipment, money. The trafficking network I exposed had connections to organized crime across 6 states. The men I helped convict had business partners who were never charged. Those partners want me dead because I'm the only living witness who can connect them to murders the federal prosecutors never built cases for. Can you still testify? Everything I have is in my head. Dates, names, account numbers, routes. I memorized all of it before the original evidence was destroyed. That's why they can't just let me disappear. As long as I'm alive, I'm a threat. Colt moved toward the curtain, then stopped, turned back. Rosie, he said, does she know about me? Claire's chin trembled. She knows her father was a brave man who rode motorcycles. I told her he lived far away and couldn't find us. She asked about you every night before bed for 2 years. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She stopped asking last year. I think she decided you weren't real. Something inside Colt broke so quietly that no one heard it. He walked out of the bay without another word. In the waiting room, the Brotherhood was on its feet. Grizzly saw Colt's face and stepped forward. Rico uncrossed his arms. Mason closed his pocket knife. Deke stopped pacing. What's the play? Grizzly asked. Colt looked at each of them. These men, damaged, scarred, carrying their own invisible wreckage from wars and prisons and childhoods that would have broken anyone with less stubborn vertebrae, had dropped everything and ridden through a killing storm because he made one phone call. They would do it again tomorrow. And the day after, without question, without hesitation, without asking what was in it for them. The child is mine, Colt said. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Claire was in witness protection. Harper knew. The people she exposed are here, in the county, right now, hunting her. 3 vehicles, at least 8 armed men. They want her dead, and they want anyone connected to her dead. That includes Rosie. That includes us. Rico spoke first. Then we move her. Tonight. Get her and the kid out of this county before she can't travel. Cracked ribs, concussion. She's not moving anywhere for at least 24 hours. Then we hold, Grizzly said. No hesitation, no deliberation. A statement of fact delivered in the same tone he might use to read a road sign. We hold right here until she can move. This is a hospital, Mason said quietly. Public building, civilians. If those men come here, they won't, Colt said. Not while there's this much attention, but the second she's discharged, the second she leaves this building and gets into a vehicle on a county road, she's exposed. We need a location, somewhere defensible, somewhere we control. The old Garrett place, Deke said. Everyone looked at him. The repair shop on Route 12. Concrete block construction, steel doors, 1 road in. We used it for storage last year. It's empty, it's off the grid, and the sight lines are clean for a quarter mile in every direction. Grizzly nodded slowly. That works? One problem, Rico said. His voice had dropped into the register he used when he was about to say something nobody wanted to hear. Harper. The name settled over the group like a cold wind. If Harper's been coordinating with federal marshals for 5 years, Rico continued, that means he has contacts inside the protection network. Contacts who might know exactly where Claire was relocated, and if her cover was blown 3 weeks ago. He let the implication hang. You're saying Harper's compromised, Mason said. I'm saying someone told those men where to find her, and the list of people who knew her location is very short. The Colt shook his head. Harper didn't sell her out. How do you know that? Because if he wanted her dead, he wouldn't have coordinated her protection in the first place. People change, Rico said. Money changes them. Threats change them. 5 years is a long time to keep a secret, and Harper's been running this county on a budget that barely keeps the lights on. You want to bet your daughter's life on the assumption that a man who already proved he can lie to your face for half a decade is still loyal? The words landed like shrapnel. Colt stepped toward Rico, and the space between them charged with something electric and unstable. Careful, Colt said. Rico didn't back down. He never did. That was what made him invaluable as road captain and infuriating as a human being. He would say the thing nobody wanted to hear, even when the man standing in front of him could put him through a wall. I'm not your enemy, brother. I'm the one asking the question that keeps your kid alive. If there's a leak, it's either inside the federal system or it's inside this county. And right now, the only person in this county who knew Claire Bennett was still breathing is the sheriff who lied to all of us. Grizzly stepped between them, not physically separating them, just occupying the space with his enormous presence, a human buffer zone. Rico's not wrong, Grizzly said to Colt. And you're not wrong. Both things can be true. Harper might be clean and still be the weak link. His communications, his files, his department, any of it could have been compromised without his knowledge. We don't trust. We verify. That's how this works. Colt exhaled through his teeth. The anger didn't leave. It just redistributed, spreading through his bloodstream like a toxin being absorbed into tissue where it could do its damage slowly. Fine, Colt said. Mason, I need you here with Claire and Rosie. Nobody gets past that curtain without a patch or a stethoscope. Deke, get to the Garrett property and start making it defensible. I want sightlines cleared and exits mapped before sunrise. Rico, reach out to every contact we have in the federal system. I want to know who authorized Claire's protection, who managed her relocation, and whose office shut down 3 weeks ago without explanation. And Harper? Grizzly asked. Colt's face was stone. I'll handle Harper. He turned toward the exit. The automatic doors hissed open, and cold air flooded in carrying the smell of snow and diesel exhaust. His bike was still at the bus shelter on Route 9. He needed a ride. Grizzly tossed him a set of keys without being asked. The spare truck, a battered Ford F-250 that lived behind the clubhouse. Colt caught them one-handed. Colt! He stopped. Grizzly's voice was low enough that only the two of them could hear. Whatever Harper tells you, whatever the reason, whatever the excuse, remember that your daughter is in that hospital bed right now because a system designed to protect her mother failed. People built that system, and people broke it. Don't confuse the ones who tried to help with the ones who pulled it apart. Colt didn't respond. He walked into the storm. He found Harper at the county sheriff's station on Main Street, a single-story brick building with a flagpole out front and bars on the windows that were supposed to keep people in, but always felt like they were keeping the truth from getting out. The lights were on despite the hour. Harper's cruiser sat in the lot with the engine off and snow already accumulating on the hood. Colt didn't knock. He walked through the front door, past the empty dispatch desk, down the narrow hallway lined with wanted posters and safety bulletins, and into Harper's office. The sheriff was sitting behind his desk with a bottle of bourbon and a glass. The bottle was a third empty. The glass was full. He looked up when Colt entered, and his face carried the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment for 5 years and dreading every second of its approach. "Sit down, Mercer." "No." Harper sighed. He looked at the bourbon, looked at Colt, took a drink. "She told you," he said. "Not a question. Everything." "Then you know why I did it." "I know what you told yourself. I know the story you built to sleep at night. I want to hear you say it to my face." Harper set the glass down. His hands were steady, the hands of a man who had been carrying a weight so long his muscles had adapted to it. "I coordinated with the U.S. Marshals to relocate Claire under a new identity because the alternative was watching her die. The trafficking network she exposed had assets inside 3 law enforcement agencies, including the FBI field office handling her case. 2 witnesses were killed within 6 months of the initial arrests. Claire was next. The marshals came to me because I was the only local contact they trusted. Small county, small department, no ties to the organization she was threatening. And me? You were the reason she almost refused to go." Colt's hands tightened at his sides. "She wanted to tell you," Harper said. "She fought me on it for 3 days. But I showed her the files, the dead witnesses, the compromised agents, the surveillance photos of you and the saints that the network had already collected. If she told you, you would have tried to protect her, and trying to protect her would have killed both of you. That was my choice to make." "No." Harper's voice hardened. "It wasn't. Because your choice would have gotten her killed, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Not for your pride, not for your broken heart, not for the romantic notion that love conquers operational security. She's alive, Mercer. Your daughter is alive. And they're alive because I made the decision you would never have been willing to make." Colt crossed the office in 2 strides. His fist hit the desk hard enough to crack the wood veneer. Papers scattered. The bourbon bottle jumped. 5 years, Colt said. His voice was a low rumble, tectonic, the sound of something fundamental shifting beneath the surface. "I have a daughter who thinks I'm not real, who stopped asking about me because she decided I was a story her mother made up. I missed her first word, her first steps, her first everything. And you sat across from me in this office and told me to move on." Harper met his eyes without flinching. "And I'd do it again." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Harper opened his desk drawer and pulled out a file folder. He slid it across the desk toward Colt. The folder was thick, worn at the edges, marked with a case number that didn't match any county filing system. 3 weeks ago, Harper said, I received a call from the marshal who managed Claire's case. He told me the protection program covering her region had been defunded in a budget reconciliation. No transition plan, no reassignment. 26 witnesses across 4 states lost their coverage overnight. He gave me a warning. Claire's file had been flagged for access by someone outside the authorized chain, someone with credentials that trace back to a private security firm contracted by the same people she testified against. Colt opened the folder. Inside were photographs, printed emails, surveillance logs, a web of connections that spread across the page like a disease. The people coming for her aren't freelance, Harper said. They're contracted, paid, and they have one objective: eliminate Claire Bennett and recover or destroy any testimony she can provide. They've been tracking her since the day her protection collapsed. You knew they were coming to this county. I suspected. When the storm hit and I got the call about a child on Route 9, I knew. And you didn't warn me. Harper finished his bourbon, set the glass down with exaggerated care. I've been warning you for 5 years, Mercer. You just didn't know what I was warning you about. Colt stared at the file. The photograph showed men in tactical gear, license plates from 3 different states, communication intercepts that suggested a coordinated operation with at least 2 advanced teams already in position. How long? Colt asked. Before they move? Based on the storm and road conditions, 12 hours, maybe less. They know she's here. They know she's injured. They're waiting for the weather to break so they can move without drawing attention. The hospital is public and exposed. Every entrance visible from the parking lot. 1 security guard working nights who's 63 years old and carries pepper spray. If they decide to go in, nothing stops them. Colt closed the file. He looked at Harper with an expression that was no longer anger. It was something worse. A cold, absolute clarity that stripped away every emotion and left only the mathematics of survival. "You owe me 5 years, Colt said. You can start paying tonight. I need county deputies at that hospital until we move Claire. I need the East County roads monitored, and I need you to make one more call to whatever's left of the federal system and tell them that the witness they abandoned is about to be murdered in your jurisdiction unless someone with actual authority steps in." Harper reached for his phone. "And if the federal system doesn't answer?" Colt picked up the file and walked toward the door. "Then 5 bikers and a county sheriff are all that stands between 8 armed professionals and a 4-year-old girl, and we don't get to lose." He stepped into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. His shadow stretched long across the floor. Behind him, Harper dialed. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Nobody picked up. And outside the station, through the falling snow, a black SUV with no plates rolled slowly past the building, paused at the intersection for exactly 4 seconds, then turned east toward Black Hollow Medical Center. Colt saw the black SUV from the sheriff's station window. He didn't process it immediately. His mind was still inside Harper's office, still turning over the file, still calculating the 12-hour window that had just become the only number that mattered. But his body recognized the threat before his brain caught up. Something primal and electric fired through his nervous system, the same instinct that had kept him alive on roads and in rooms where staying alive was not the expected outcome. He stopped walking. His hand went to the door frame. His eyes tracked the vehicle as it rolled past the station at a speed designed to look casual and failed completely. No plates. Tinted windows. Factory-clean exterior despite a storm that had coated every other vehicle in the county with road salt and ice. The SUV paused at the intersection. 4 seconds. Long enough for someone inside to photograph the building, note the vehicles in the lot, catalog the cruiser with the sheriff's star on the door. Then it turned east, toward the hospital. Colt was back inside Harper's office before the taillights disappeared. "They're here." Harper looked up from the phone he was still holding, the line that no one had answered. His face didn't change, but his hand tightened on the receiver until his knuckles went white. "Black SUV, no plates, just past your building heading east on Main, moved like it was running reconnaissance." Harper set the phone down. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a Remington 870 shotgun that looked like it had been racked and re-racked 1,000 times. He checked the chamber with the muscle memory of a man who had done it every shift for 30 years. "How many deputies you got tonight?" Colt asked. 2. Beckett's on patrol near the dam. Sykes is home with a broken wrist from a DUI stop last week. 1 deputy, in a storm, against 8 professionals. Welcome to rural law enforcement. They moved. Harper radioed Beckett and told him to reroute to the hospital. Code 2, no lights, no siren. Colt called Grizzly from the parking lot while Harper locked the station. The phone rang once. "They're already in the county," Colt said. 1 vehicle just past the sheriff's station heading toward the medical center. We're moving now." Grizzly's voice came back flat and immediate. "Mason's still at the hospital with Claire and the kid. I'll wake Deke at the Garrett property and get him prepping faster. Rico's on his way back from making federal calls. How long do we have?" "I don't know anymore." Harper said 12 hours. "The SUV I just saw says less." "Understood. We'll be ready." Noah. "Yeah. If anyone who isn't one of us gets within 50 feet of that hospital room, you do whatever you have to do." The line went dead. Colt drove Harper's cruiser because the sheriff's hands weren't steady enough, and neither man acknowledged it. They took back roads, County Road 7 to Mill Creek Lane, to the service entrance behind the hospital's maintenance building. Harper knew every unlit shortcut in Black Hollow the way he knew his own failures, intimately, in the dark, without needing to be told where the edges were. They pulled in behind the hospital at 1:14 a.m. The parking lot was nearly empty. A single ambulance sat in the bay with its engine off. The emergency entrance glowed with that sickly yellow fluorescence that made everything look like it was already dying. Mason Creed met them at the service door. He'd positioned himself in the hallway between the emergency department and the rear exit, a choke point that forced anyone coming from either direction to pass within arm's reach of a man who had spent 4 years as a Navy corpsman learning exactly how fragile the human body was and how little effort it took to make it stop working. "Anything?" Colt asked. "Quiet. Too quiet. The night shift nurse went home sick at midnight. Replacement hasn't shown up. There's one doctor, one aide, and the security guard who's been asleep in the break room since 11. Claire? Awake. She heard your bike wasn't in the lot and started panicking. I told her you were handling something. She didn't believe me, but she stopped asking. Rosie?" Mason's expression softened by exactly 1 degree, a shift so subtle that only someone who knew his face as well as Colt did would have noticed. "Sleeping. Still holding the rabbit. Still wearing your jacket. She woke up once about an hour ago and asked the aide if Mr. Coat was coming back. The aide didn't know what she meant." Colt moved past him into the corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. His boots left wet prints on the linoleum. He smelled antiseptic and stale coffee and the faint metallic undercurrent of old blood that never fully left hospital walls no matter how much bleach you used. He stopped outside Claire's curtain, listened to the heart monitor beeping on the other side. Steady. Alive. The sound of the woman he'd spent 5 years mourning separated from him by a sheet of fabric and a universe of broken trust. He didn't go in. Instead, he turned to the next bay where Rosie slept. He pulled the curtain back just enough to see inside. The child lay curled on her side in the hospital bed with his leather jacket pulled over her like a blanket, the stuffed rabbit tucked into the crook of her arm, the silver pendant resting against the white pillow. The heart monitor attached to her finger beeped softly. Her breathing was slow and deep, the unconscious, absolute surrender of a child who had found something she trusted enough to let her guard down. Colt watched her sleep for 30 seconds. Then he closed the curtain and went to work. Grizzly arrived at 1:40 a.m. with Rico. They came through the service entrance carrying duffel bags that clinked with the weight of things hospitals weren't designed to contain. Nobody discussed the contents. Nobody needed to. The 5 of them gathered in the maintenance corridor behind the emergency department, a narrow concrete hallway lined with electrical panels and supply closets that smelled like floor wax and copper wiring. Harper stood apart from the group, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and the shotgun propped beside him. The physical distance between the sheriff and the bikers was approximately 6 feet, but the psychological distance was measured in years of mutual suspicion held together by the thinnest possible thread of shared purpose. Rico spoke first. "I reached a contact at the U.S. Marshal's regional office in Charlotte. Took 4 calls and a threat to go to the press before anyone would talk to me. Here's what I got." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket, notes scrawled in tight, angular handwriting. The Witness Protection Program covering Claire's region was defunded 8 months ago, not 3 weeks ago. The official shutdown happened in October. Claire's case file was transferred to a regional consolidation office that doesn't have the staffing to manage active relocations. Her assigned marshal retired in January. No replacement was assigned. 8 months, Colt said. She was unprotected for 8 months before anyone found her. It gets worse. The contact told me Claire's file was accessed 17 times in the last 6 months. 17. Normal access for an inactive case is 0. Someone was pulling her records regularly. New address, new name, employment records, school enrollment for Rosie, everything. Who? The access credentials trace back to a private consulting firm called Meridian Risk Solutions. On paper, they're a corporate security outfit based out of Arlington, Virginia. In practice, Rico looked at Harper. "You want to tell them, or should I?" Every head in the corridor turned toward the sheriff. Harper's face had gone gray. Not the gray of exhaustion or cold, but the ashen, bloodless gray of a man watching something he built collapse in real time. Meridian was the firm the federal prosecutors used to manage logistics during the trafficking trial, Harper said. His voice was barely audible. Security for witnesses, secure transportation, communications infrastructure. They were embedded in the operation from the beginning. And now they're the ones hunting Claire, Rico said. The same people who were paid to protect the witnesses are the ones selling their locations to the people who want them dead. It's not a leak, Colt. It's not a compromise. It's the entire system inverted. The guards became the hunters. Silence. The kind of silence that has physical mass, pressing against eardrums, compressing chest cavities, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Grizzly was the first to move. He rubbed his massive hands over his face, dragging calloused palms across his beard, and exhaled with the controlled, deliberate cadence of a man disarming something explosive inside himself. How many witnesses are we talking about? Total? 26 were in the program when it was defunded, Rico said. My contact wouldn't tell me how many are still alive. Would he tell you how many are dead? Rico folded the paper and put it back in his jacket. He hung up. Mason Creed leaned against the opposite wall, his arms folded, his scarred face unreadable. He hadn't spoken since the briefing started. Now he looked at Colt with the flat, analytical stare of a man who had spent years triaging casualties, sorting the living from the dying from the dead, with nothing but his hands and a set of criteria that nobody outside a combat zone would ever understand. The math doesn't work, Mason said quietly. Everyone looked at him. 8 men, 3 vehicles. That's a tactical team, small, mobile, designed for a single extraction or elimination. If Meridian is running this as a coordinated operation across multiple states, they're not sending one team. They're sending teams to every witness simultaneously, which means this isn't a manhunt, it's a purge. The word hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody could see. If they're eliminating witnesses across the board, Mason continued, then the men coming here aren't operating on a flexible timeline. They have a schedule, a window. They need Claire dealt with before she can be re-entered into any system, before anyone with authority realizes the program collapsed and starts asking questions. That window closes the moment federal attention returns to these cases. When does it close? Colt asked. Based on Rico's intel, the defunding happened 8 months ago. The first file access was 6 months ago. I'd estimate they've been executing this for at least 4 months. If they're running parallel operations across 4 states, they're near the end. Claire might be one of the last. Or the most important, Harper said. Everyone turned to him again. The sheriff pushed off the wall and took a step forward. His face had aged 10 years in the last hour. The lines around his eyes looked like cracks in old concrete, and his hands hung at his sides with the weighted stillness of a man about to confess something he'd been carrying so long it had fused to his bones. Claire isn't just a witness, Harper said. She's the witness. The original case, the trafficking operation she exposed, resulted in 14 convictions. But those 14 were the ones the prosecutors could build cases against using physical evidence, electronic records, financial documents. What they couldn't use was Claire's direct testimony linking the convicted traffickers to a second network, a network of buyers, politicians, businessmen, people whose names never appeared in any court filing because the evidence connecting them to the operation existed in only one place. He tapped his temple. Her memory. She told me, Colt said. Dates, names, routes. She memorized everything. She memorized more than everything. She memorized connections that the federal prosecutors didn't even know existed when the original case was built. Connections between the trafficking network and people in positions of power who used their influence to protect the operation for over a decade. She tried to share this information before she was relocated, but the prosecutors told her it was outside the scope of the existing case. They didn't want to open a second investigation because the political implications were... Harper stopped, chose his next word with visible effort. Complicated. Complicated, Rico repeated, and the word carried the weight of every institution that had ever decided a woman's life was less important than political convenience. So they buried her instead, Grizzly said. Put her in a hole with a new name and pretended the information she carried didn't exist. They protected her. They silenced her. There's a difference. Harper didn't argue. He didn't have the ground to stand on. The people hunting her now, Mason said, working through the logic with surgical precision, aren't just eliminating a witness to a closed case. They're eliminating the only person alive who can connect the convicted traffickers to their untouched partners. If Claire testifies, or if anyone with authority interviews her and takes a detailed statement, the second network collapses. People go to prison, powerful people. People who can afford to hire Meridian Risk Solutions to make sure that never happens, Rico finished. Colt stood in the center of the corridor. The fluorescent light above him flickered once, a brief, stuttering darkness that made everyone's shadow jump and resettle. He looked at the men around him. 4 bikers and a county sheriff standing in a hospital maintenance hallway at 2 a.m, piecing together a conspiracy that stretched across state lines and into the offices of people who would never see the inside of a courtroom. 5 years ago, Claire Bennett tried to do the right thing. The system thanked her by erasing her identity, taking her away from the man she loved, and forcing her to raise a child alone under a borrowed name in a succession of anonymous apartments in cities where she knew no one. When the system couldn't afford to protect her anymore, it didn't warn her, it didn't transition her, it just stopped, like a machine running out of fuel, and left her standing in the open while the people she'd fought to expose sent professionals to finish what the courts never started. And now that system's failure had delivered her back to the one place it had spent 5 years keeping her away from. Back to Colt. Back to the Iron Saints. Back to the only men who had ever tried to protect her without an agenda, without a budget line, without asking permission from anyone. "We need to move her tonight," Colt said. "Not in 12 hours. Not at dawn. Now. Before those vehicles regroup and before whoever's coordinating this realizes she's in a building with 1 security guard and no law enforcement presence. She can't." The doctor's warning about cracked ribs and a concussion echoed in his mind, and he cut through it with the ruthless efficiency of a man who understood that survivable pain was infinitely preferable to a comfortable death. She can sit upright and she can breathe. That's enough. We wrap her ribs, load painkillers, and move. The Garrett property is 22 minutes from here on back roads. Deke's already there. "The child," Grizzly said. Colt's jaw tightened. "Rosie rides with me. And if they intercept us on the road? Then 5 bikes and a county cruiser make a convoy that's harder to stop than a single ambulance on an empty highway." Harper spoke. "I'll lead. County vehicle. Lights active. Anyone following will think it's an official transport." Colt looked at him. The hatred hadn't gone. It lived in a place behind his ribs where it would burn for years, maybe forever. But hatred was a luxury, and right now, every luxury had been stripped from the equation. There was only the math, the cold, merciless arithmetic of getting a 4-year-old and her mother from one building to another without dying on the road between. "Fine," Colt said. "You lead." They moved in 12 minutes. Mason woke Claire and explained the situation in the medic's voice. Flat, clinical, devoid of emotion, because emotion created hesitation, and hesitation killed people. She listened without interruption. When he finished, she swung her legs off the bed, gripped the IV stand, and stood up. The pain bent her double for 3 seconds. She breathed through it with her teeth clenched and her eyes shut, and then straightened and looked at Mason with an expression that said nothing and meant everything. "Get me tape for my ribs," she said, "and take out the IV. I can't run with a pole." Mason wrapped her torso with elastic bandage, pulled tight enough to stabilize the fractures without restricting her breathing below survivable levels. He gave her 4 ibuprofen and a bottle of water and didn't insult her by asking if she was okay. Colt went to Rosie. The child was still asleep. He stood beside the bed and looked at her face. His daughter's face. The face he'd never seen before tonight. The face that held features he recognized from his own mirror mixed with features that belonged to the woman in the next room. And he felt something so vast and terrifying that his hands trembled. He had protected strangers. He had protected brothers. He had protected women he barely knew because the code demanded it, and the code was the only structure that held his life together. But this was different. This was the thing he never knew existed coming into focus with the clarity of a rifle scope. And the crosshairs weren't on a target. They were on his own heart. He picked her up. She woke halfway, murmuring, confused, her fingers clutching the rabbit by reflex. She recognized his smell before she opened her eyes. Leather, engine oil, cold iron. "Mr. Coate?" she whispered. "Yeah, we're going for a ride. Is Mommy coming?" Mommy's right behind us. She pressed her face into his shoulder and was asleep again within seconds. They loaded into vehicles behind the hospital. Harper's cruiser took point. Colt rode in the cab of Grizzly's truck, with Rosie buckled into a car seat Mason had taken from the hospital's pediatric supply closet. Claire sat in the back seat, her jaw locked against the pane. A pistol. Her own. The one from the wrecked SUV, resting on the seat beside her. Grizzly drove. Rico rode his Harley behind the truck as a rear guard, his headlight cutting through the snow like a single eye watching the darkness. Mason followed in a second vehicle with supplies from the hospital, bandages, medications, a portable oxygen tank he'd convinced the night aide to release by showing an expired medical credential, and a face that did not invite follow-up questions. They pulled out of the hospital lot at 2:31 a.m. The roads were empty and murderous. Black ice under fresh snow, visibility down to 30 feet, the wind rocking the truck on exposed stretches where the terrain opened up and the storm hit broadside. Harper's cruiser led at 35 miles per hour, with blue lights painting the snow in pulsing rhythmic bursts that made the world look like it was breathing. Nobody spoke inside the truck. Colt sat with one arm around the car seat where Rosie slept and his eyes on the side mirror. Behind them, Rico's headlight bounced and swayed with the road's imperfections, a steady presence in the darkness. Ahead, Harper's taillights were twin red pinpoints in the white void. Claire sat in the back seat with her forehead pressed against the cold window. Her breath fogged the glass. Every bump sent a visible shock through her body as her ribs protested the motion, but she made no sound. She had spent 5 years learning to suffer in silence, and the skill had become so ingrained that it no longer required effort. "Colt," she said. He didn't turn around. "There's something I didn't tell you at the hospital." His grip on the car seat tightened. "The man who showed up at Rosie's school 3 weeks ago, the one who left my name on the car. I recognized him." Now Colt turned. Claire's face was half lit by the passing glow of Harper's lights, her bruises dark and mottled, her eyes carrying something that looked like the last reserves of courage being spent on one final truth. "His name is Warren Foyle. He was the lead investigator on the original trafficking case. He was the one who recruited me as an informant. He was the one who convinced me to gather evidence, who promised me protection, who told me I was doing the right thing and that the system would keep me safe." The federal investigator. "He left the bureau 2 years after the trial, went private, and the company he joined—" She paused. The truck hit a rut and her face contorted with pain. She breathed through it and continued. "The company he joined was Meridian Risk Solutions." The name detonated inside the cab like a grenade thrown into a closed room. "The man who recruited you to testify," Colt said slowly, "is now running the operation to kill you. He built my file. He knows everything about me. My real identity, my habits, my psychological profile, my weaknesses. He knows I memorized the second network connections because he was the one who asked me to. He's the one who told me to keep the information in my head because digital records could be destroyed." Claire's voice cracked. "He was building a weapon. He just didn't tell me I was the weapon, and he was building me to be dismantled." Grizzly's hands tightened on the steering wheel. In the mirror, his eyes were black and focused with the predatory stillness of a man who had spent years in combat zones learning to compress rage into something usable. "Foyle knows your behavioral patterns." Mason's voice came through the radio from the vehicle behind them. He'd been listening on the open channel. "He knows how you think, how you run, what decisions you make under pressure. That means every move you've made in the last 3 weeks has been predicted. The route you took, the motels you chose, the direction you ran." "He hurted me," Claire said. "I knew it. I could feel it. Every time I thought I'd lost them, they appeared again. Not close enough to catch me, just close enough to steer me. They wanted me to keep moving in a specific direction." "Toward Black Hollow," Colt said. Silence. "They wanted you here," he continued. The realization assembled itself in his mind with the mechanical precision of a weapon being loaded. "They wanted you back in this county, where the original evidence was gathered, where the witnesses who helped you lived, where—" He stopped, looked at Grizzly, looked in the mirror at Claire. "Where the Iron Saints are." "One operation," Mason said over the radio. "One location. Claire, the evidence she carries, and the people who helped her collect it. All in the same place at the same time. A single sweep, They're not just coming for Claire, Rico's voice cut through the static from his bike, sharp and wind-torn. They're coming for all of us. The truck's headlights illuminated the turn onto County Road 12. The Garrett property appeared through the snow. A low, flat-roofed concrete building surrounded by dead grass and rusted equipment. Its windows dark, its steel front door reflecting the headlights like a single blind eye. Deke Holloway stood in the doorway with a flashlight and a face that said he'd heard every word on the radio. They pulled inside the garage bay. The steel doors rolled shut behind them. The sound of the storm muffled to a dull, constant pressure against the walls. Inside, Deke had set up propane heaters, camp lanterns, and a folding table covered with maps of the county roads that he'd marked with red pen, sight lines, choke points, approach vectors. Colt carried Rosie to the small office at the back of the garage. It had a concrete floor, no windows, and a heavy steel door, the most defensible room in the building. He laid her on a cot Deke had assembled from storage and covered her with blankets and his leather jacket. The rabbit went beside her. The pendant caught the lantern light. He closed the door quietly and returned to the main garage. Claire was sitting on a metal folding chair with Mason rechecking her bandages. Her face was the color of old paper. She watched Colt cross the room and saw in his expression the thing she'd feared most. Not anger, not grief, but the cold, calculating transformation of a man who had just learned that the enemy was larger and closer and more personal than anyone had imagined. "Foyle," Colt said to the room. "The federal investigator who turned contractor. He's running this. He knows Claire. He knows us. He knows this county. And he herded her here because he wants to clean everything in one pass." "Which means he knows we'll protect her," Grizzly said. "He's counting on it. He wants us clustered." "Then we don't cluster." Colt moved to the table with Deke's maps. His finger traced the roads. "The Garrett property is defensive, but it's static. If Foyle knows Claire is here, and he will, because he's been tracking her for 3 weeks and he didn't lose her in a snowstorm, he'll set up containment on these 2 roads and wait for the storm to break. Then he moves in." "So we move first," Rico said. "No. We let him come." Colt's eyes were locked on the map. "We let him commit to this location. We let him bring his team in close. And while he's focused on this building, Harper takes Claire and Rosie out through the back service road to the county airstrip." "The airstrip's been closed since October," Harper said. "Closed doesn't mean demolished. Is the runway intact?" "Should be." "Then you get them to that airstrip and you call every favor you've ever earned with the federal marshals, the FBI, whoever picks up a phone. You get them on a plane and you get them out of this state." "And what do you do?" Claire's voice came from the chair where Mason was taping her ribs. She stared at Colt with an expression that held 5 years of accumulated fear for exactly this moment. The moment the man she loved chose to stand between her and the thing trying to kill her, which was exactly what she'd disappeared to prevent. Colt looked at her, looked at the door behind which his daughter slept. "I do what I've always done," he said. "I stay. They'll kill you. Maybe. Colt, you left to protect me. You gave up everything, your name, your life, our daughter. Because you decided that keeping me alive was worth more than being with me. You made that choice for 5 years. Now it's my turn." Claire's composure finally broke. Not dramatically, not with sobs or screaming or the theatrical collapse of someone performing grief. It broke quietly, internally, like a foundation giving way beneath a structure that had been holding too much weight for too long. Tears ran down her bruised face without sound. Her hands gripped the edges of the folding chair until her knuckles turned white. "She needs you alive," Claire whispered. "Not brave. Alive. Then I'll be both." Grizzly put his hand on Colt's shoulder. The weight of it was enormous. Physically, emotionally, the accumulated gravity of 15 years of brotherhood compressed into 5 fingers on denim. "We'll be both," Grizzly corrected. Rico nodded. Mason closed his medical kit. Deke checked the action on a shotgun with the practiced ease of a man who understood mechanical things better than emotional ones. Harper stood near the door, watching the bikers with an expression Colt couldn't read, somewhere between shame and admiration, between the guilt of a man who had helped create this disaster and the reluctant awe of watching 5 men volunteer to stand in its path. "I'll make the calls," Harper said. "I'll get them to the airstrip." But you need to understand something, Mercer. If Foyle's team is as professional as the intelligence suggests, 5 men in a concrete garage won't hold them. You're buying time, not winning a war. Time is all she needs, Colt said. Always has been. Harper left through the back entrance. His cruiser started in the cold. Headlights swept across the garage wall as he pulled out, and then the sound of his engine faded into the storm until there was nothing but wind and the tick of cooling metal from the bikes lined up inside. Colt sat down at the table. The map spread before him like a landscape of decisions, each road a choice, each intersection a consequence. The lantern threw his shadow against the wall, enormous, distorted, barely human. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. 4 words. "We know she's there." He stared at the screen. The light from it turned his face blue-white in the dark garage. Around him, 4 men who had ridden through a blizzard, absorbed a conspiracy, and chosen to stand in front of a bullet they couldn't see were checking weapons and mapping exits and saying nothing because everything that mattered had already been said. Colt deleted the message. Then he turned off his phone, looked at the steel door behind which his daughter slept, and began planning how to survive the next 12 hours against men who had been paid to make sure he didn't. Outside, the storm reached its peak. Wind screamed across the flatlands surrounding the Garrett property and hammered the concrete walls with snow that sounded like gravel. Somewhere on the county roads, 3 black SUVs repositioned in the darkness. And in the small office at the back of the garage, Rosie Mercer, wearing a biker's leather jacket, clutching a stuffed rabbit, warmed by a pendant that had traveled across 5 years and 1,000 miles of running, slept without dreaming. She didn't know that her father was sitting 30 feet away preparing to fight for her life. She didn't know that the men who wanted to erase her mother from the world were circling closer with every passing minute. She only knew that the coat smelled safe, and for 1 more hour, that was enough. The first engine sound reached the garage at 4:17 a.m. Not a car, not a truck. Something heavier. A diesel rumble that vibrated through the concrete floor and climbed up through Colt's boots into his spine. He was standing at the workbench loading shells into a pump-action shotgun when he felt it. His hands stopped moving. His head tilted. Every man in the room went still at the same instant, the way animals freeze when the air pressure changes before a storm. Rico was closest to the front wall. He pressed his ear against the cold concrete and listened with his eyes closed, his face tight with concentration. After 3 seconds, he held up 1 finger, then 2, then 3. 3 vehicles. Approaching from the east on County Road 12. Moving slowly, 20, maybe 25 miles per hour. The speed of vehicles running without headlights in a snowstorm, navigating by GPS and infrared. "They're early," Grizzly said. Colt checked the clock on the wall. Harper had left for the airstrip 90 minutes ago. He needed at least another hour to get the runway cleared, make his calls, and arrange transport. The plan depended on time, buying enough of it for Claire and Rosie to get airborne before Foyle's team realized the building they were assaulting was a shell. But Foyle was early. "Deke," Colt said. Deke was already at the narrow observation slit he'd cut into the steel garage door, a 6-inch gap covered with a welding curtain that let him see out without being seen. He pressed binoculars to his eyes and scanned the road. 3 SUVs. Stopped about 400 yards out, just past the tree line. Engines running, no lights. They're sitting. "Staging," Mason said from the corner where he'd positioned himself near the rear exit. His voice was clinical, detached, the combat medic receding behind the combat, leaving only a man who understood tactical formations the way a surgeon understood anatomy. "They'll send a scout element first, 2 men, maybe 3, to confirm the target's inside and map the entry points. Main force holds until the scouts report back." "How long before they move?" 10 minutes, maybe 15 if they're cautious. Colt looked at the office door. Behind it, Claire sat on the cot beside Rosie with the pistol in her lap, and a look on her face that Colt had seen once before, the night she told him she was going to testify against men who would kill her for it. The look of a woman who had already accepted the worst possible outcome and was operating in the space beyond fear where only decisions remained. He'd sent Harper's cruiser out the back service road 40 minutes ago. Claire and Rosie were supposed to be in it. But the service road was blocked, a fallen pine across the narrow track, brought down by the storm's weight, too large to move without a chainsaw, and too positioned to be accidental. Deke had found it when he went to clear the root. The cut marks on the trunk were clean. Someone had dropped that tree deliberately, hours before the Saints arrived. Foyle had planned for the back door, which meant Claire and Rosie were still in the building, which meant the distraction wasn't a distraction anymore. It was the last stand. Harper was at the airstrip trying to reach federal contacts on a phone that had connected exactly once in the last hour before dropping the signal. He didn't know the back road was blocked. He didn't know the plan had collapsed. By the time he figured it out and circled back on county roads, the math would already be finished. Colt had told Claire 20 minutes ago. She didn't scream, didn't cry. She looked at Rosie sleeping on the cot, then looked at him and said, "Then we hold here." Not a question, not a plea. A statement from a woman who had been running for 3 weeks and 5 years before that and had simply run out of road. "Positions," Colt said. They moved without discussion, each man flowing to his assigned location with the fluid, automatic precision of men who had trained for violence the way other people trained for marathons. Not because they wanted to, but because stopping meant something worse. Grizzly took the front wall, positioning himself behind a steel tool cabinet he'd dragged across the concrete floor to create a barricade between the garage door and the interior. The cabinet weighed 300 pounds. He'd moved it alone. His breathing was steady, deep, controlled. The rhythm of a man who had learned in Afghanistan that panic was a physiological response that could be overridden by training, and that the men who survived were the ones whose hands stayed still when their hearts were screaming. Rico took the east wall near the side door, a rusted metal exit that opened onto a narrow strip of gravel between the garage and an abandoned storage shed. He'd reinforced the door with a steel bar across the inside and positioned a workbench in front of it as a secondary barrier. From this position, he could cover the side approach and pivot to support either Grizzly at the front or Mason at the rear. Mason held the back exit, the heavy steel door that led to the blocked service road. He sat on an overturned bucket with a rifle across his knees and his medical kit open on the floor beside him. Gauze, tourniquets, hemostatic agents, a bag of saline he'd taken from the hospital. The medic and the fighter, occupying the same body, each waiting for the other to become necessary. Deke roamed. That was his function in every crisis. The mobile element, the man who moved between positions with nervous energy channeled into purpose. He checked sightlines, redistributed ammunition, reinforced weak points with whatever materials the garage offered. A man in constant motion because stillness made him remember things he'd spent years trying to forget. Colt stood in the center of the garage. From here, he could see every position, every door, every window. The camp lanterns cast long shadows that swayed with the draft leaking through the walls. The propane heaters hissed. Outside, wind hammered the building with the mechanical persistence of something trying to get in. He checked his phone one last time. Dead. No signal. The storm or the men outside, or both, had killed the cell coverage. They were alone. "Movement," Deke said from the observation slit. 2 men on foot, coming through the tree line at the northeast corner. Tactical gear, plate carriers, nods, suppressed rifles. "They're good." "Let them come," Colt said. "Let them see what they want to see. The second they report back, the main force commits. That's when we hit them." "With what?" Rico asked. Not sarcasm. Inventory. 5 shotguns, 2 rifles, and a combined ammunition count that lasts about 6 minutes of sustained fire against 8 men with military-grade equipment. "We're not trying to win a firefight. We're trying to survive long enough for Harper to bring help." "And if Harper doesn't bring help?" Colt didn't answer. The question didn't require one. Every man in the building understood the arithmetic, and every man had chosen to stand here anyway. Not because the odds were favorable, but because a 4-year-old was sleeping 30 feet away, and the men coming to hurt her would have to step over 5 bodies to reach her. That was the math, the only math that mattered. The scouts disappeared back into the tree line after 4 minutes. Deke tracked them through the binoculars until the snow swallowed their outlines. "They'll know we're here," Mason said. "Heat signatures from the propane, vehicle tracks in the snow. They'll know it's not just Claire." "Good," Grizzly said. "Let them know." 3 minutes of silence. The longest 3 minutes Colt had ever experienced. Each second stretched into a small eternity filled with the sound of breathing, the hiss of propane, the creak of the building settling against the wind. He used the time the way he'd learned to use every quiet moment before violence. Not to think about what was coming, but to think about what he was protecting. Rosie's face, the way she said Mr. Coat, the weight of her body when he carried her off the highway, the rabbit with one button eye. Claire's voice saying, "She asked about you every night." He loaded the last shell into the shotgun and racked it. "Here they come," Deke said. Headlights exploded through the snow. All three SUVs surged forward simultaneously, abandoning stealth for speed, their engines roaring across the open ground between the tree line and the garage. High beams flooded the building with blinding white light that poured through every crack and gap in the walls, turning the interior into a strobe of shadow and glare. The first SUV angled toward the front garage door. The second swung wide to the east, targeting the side entrance. The third circled the building toward the rear, toward the blocked service road, toward Mason's position, toward the only exit that led anywhere near the office where Claire and Rosie waited. They moved in coordinated formation. Professional. Rehearsed. The kind of precision that came from men who had done this before, not once, not twice, but enough times to reduce the act of killing to a series of mechanical steps executed without emotion. "Contact front!" Grizzly roared. The garage door exploded inward. Not rammed, detonated. A breaching charge blew the bottom third of the steel door off its tracks and sent it cartwheeling across the concrete floor in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Cold air and snow and noise rushed through the gap like a wave breaking. Grizzly fired through the opening before the dust settled. The shotgun blast lit the garage in a yellow-white flash. The sound was enormous, a concussive punch that hammered the walls and made the lanterns swing wildly on their hooks. Through the smoke, a figure staggered backward into the snow. A second figure came through the gap, low and fast, rifle up, moving with the fluid, practiced motion of someone who had cleared rooms in places where the rooms were designed to kill you. He fired twice. The rounds hit the steel cabinet inches from Grizzly's head, punching through the thin metal and sending fragments spinning. Grizzly racked the shotgun and fired again. The figure dropped, but a third was already through, and a fourth behind him, and the front of the garage became a corridor of muzzle flash and ricochets and the screaming sound of metal being torn apart by high-velocity impacts. "East side!" Rico shouted. The side door buckled inward. The steel bar held, but the frame around it cracked, old concrete giving way under the force of a ram. Rico fired through the gap between the door and the frame, a controlled burst that was answered by return fire so close he could feel the heat of the rounds passing his head. He dropped behind the workbench. Wood and metal erupted above him. Deke sprinted across the garage floor in a crouch, sliding behind a stack of tires near the east wall. He rose, fired twice through a gap in the wall he'd identified during his preparations, and ducked again as rounds chewed through the corrugated metal above him. The noise was beyond anything the building was designed to contain. Gunfire echoed off concrete walls and amplified into a continuous, disorienting roar that made communication impossible. The lanterns were shot out within the first 30 seconds, one by a stray round, two by Colt, who killed them deliberately because darkness favored the defenders who knew the layout over attackers who didn't. The garage plunged into blackness cut only by muzzle flash. Colt moved through the dark on instinct and memory. He'd walked this floor 100 times in the last 3 hours, mapping every obstacle, every piece of equipment, every change in surface that could trip or slow him. His boots found the concrete seams. His shoulders brushed the wall at the exact points he'd memorized. The shotgun was an extension of his arms, heavy, warm, alive with the mechanical certainty that it would do exactly what he asked it to do. A figure appeared in the blown-out garage door, silhouetted against the headlights of the SUV outside. Colt fired from 12 feet. The figure flew backward into the snow and didn't move. Return fire came from his right. The side door had finally given way. Rico was screaming something he couldn't hear. Rounds hit the concrete wall behind Colt and threw chips of stone across his neck like burning insects. He dropped flat, rolled behind an engine block sitting on the floor, and fired twice more through the smoke. "Back door!" Mason's voice cut through the chaos with the clarity of a man who had trained his vocal cords to carry over explosions. "They're breaching the back!" The rear of the garage erupted. The steel door held longer than the front. Mason had reinforced it with welding stock and angle iron. But the breaching charge was bigger. The blast blew the door inward and threw Mason backward off his bucket. He hit the concrete floor shoulder first, rolled, and came up firing from a prone position with the rifle braced against a floor drain. 2 attackers came through the smoke. Mason hit the first one center mass. The man staggered but didn't fall. Plate carrier absorbed the round. Mason adjusted and fired again, lower. The man dropped. The second attacker fired a burst that stitched across the floor toward Mason's position, sparks jumping where the rounds hit concrete. Deke appeared from the darkness. He crossed the distance to the second attacker in 3 steps and hit him with a length of steel pipe he'd pulled from the wall rack. The impact was savage, the sound of metal meeting bone and body armor in a collision that had no winners. The attacker went down. Deke hit him again to make sure. Colt ran for the office door. The corridor between the main garage and the back office was 10 feet long and completely dark. His boots pounded concrete. His breathing was a ragged animal thing, lungs burning from smoke and cold and adrenaline. He could hear gunfire behind him, disorganized now, the disciplined patterns of the initial assault breaking down into something messier and more desperate. The attackers had expected resistance. They hadn't expected this. He reached the office door and pulled it open. Claire was standing in the center of the small room with the pistol raised in both hands, her arms locked, her eyes wide, her bandaged torso heaving with each breath. Rosie was behind her on the cot, awake now, clutching the rabbit with both fists, her face buried in the leather jacket. She wasn't crying, she wasn't screaming, she was silent with the absolute terrified stillness of a child who understood on some primal level that sound meant danger. "It's me," Colt said. Claire's arms dropped 2 inches. Her fingers stayed on the trigger. "How many?" she asked. "We've dropped at least 4. Don't know how many are left. Harper's not back. The back road's still blocked." "The front?" "Open. Grizzly's holding it, but—" An explosion shook the building. Not a breach charge. Something bigger. The overhead lights, already dead, showered glass from their fixtures. Dust rained from the ceiling. The cot shifted on the concrete floor. "They're breaching the wall," Claire said. She'd heard that sound before. In the motel outside Tulsa. In the rental house in New Mexico. The sound of men with tools and training and patience dismantling the barriers between them and their target 1 layer at a time. Colt looked at his daughter. Rosie's eyes were open now, staring at him over the top of the rabbit's head. Brown eyes. Claire's eyes. His eyes, if he was honest. The same shape, the same depth, the same stubborn refusal to look away from things that should have been too frightening to face. "Mr. Coate," she whispered. "The loud noises." "I know, baby. Make them stop." Something broke and reformed inside Colt Mercer in the space between those words and his next breath. The man who walked into this building 3 hours ago, the vice president of a motorcycle club, the scarred and solitary outlaw who rode alone through storms because pain was the only company that didn't leave, that man dissolved. What replaced him was older and newer at the same time, simpler, more dangerous, a father. "Stay with Mommy," he said. "Don't come out until I come back." He closed the office door. He heard Claire drag the cot against it from the inside. In the main garage, the situation had deteriorated from controlled chaos into something raw. Grizzly was bleeding. A round had caught him across the left forearm, a deep graze that laid the skin open in a 4-inch line and pumped blood down his wrist into his glove. He'd wrapped it with a strip torn from his shirt without stopping fighting. His shotgun was empty. He'd transitioned to a revolver he kept in his boot and was firing measured shots through the destroyed front door at figures moving between the SUVs outside. Rico had taken a hit too. Shrapnel from the side door breach had embedded in his left thigh, turning his jeans dark from the knee down. He was still mobile, still fighting from behind the overturned workbench, but his movements had slowed. Each step left a red print on the concrete. Mason was the only one uninjured, which made sense, because Mason was the one who understood exactly how bodies broke, and therefore understood exactly how to keep his own body out of the trajectories that would break it. He had repositioned to the center of the garage behind the engine block Colt had used earlier, and was providing covering fire in short, disciplined bursts that kept the rear entrance suppressed. Deke was somewhere in the darkness near the east wall, identifiable only by the occasional muzzle flash of his weapon and the sound of his breathing. Fast, ragged, the breathing of a young man running on pure adrenaline and fury. Colt took stock in 3 seconds. 4 attackers down. He could see bodies in the snow through the front door and near the rear entrance. That left at least 4 more, possibly 5 if the scout element had rejoined. The SUVs were repositioning outside, their headlights sweeping across the building like searchlights, trying to illuminate the interior for shooters who'd lost their night vision advantage when the defenders killed the lanterns. Grizzly, status! Breathing, bleeding, angry. Rico, legs hit. I can still fight. Can't run. Mason, holding. Rear is suppressed, but they'll push again. 60 seconds, maybe less. Deke! Silence. Deke! A cough from the darkness near the east wall. Then Deke's voice, strained and wet-sounding. I'm here! Took one in the vest. Ribs are... A pause filled with a sound that was unmistakably pain being swallowed. Ribs are not great. Colt crossed the garage to Deke's position. He found the youngest saint slumped against the wall with his hand pressed against his left side. The body armor had stopped the round, but the impact had cracked ribs. The same injury Claire carried, the same brutal mathematics of kinetic energy transferred through Kevlar into bone. Can you shoot? Can I breathe barely? Can I shoot? Watch me. Colt gripped Deke's shoulder, squeezed once, moved on. The second push came 45 seconds later. 2 attackers hit the rear entrance simultaneously, using the wrecked door as cover and firing in a leapfrog pattern that forced Mason to keep his head down while one advanced and the other covered. They were inside the building before Mason could stop them. 2 men in tactical black moving through the smoke with the efficient, terrifying grace of trained operators. Mason engaged the first one at close range. The rifle barked twice. The attacker's plate carrier took both rounds and he kept coming, closing the distance, transitioning to a sidearm. Mason dropped the rifle and met him in the dark. The sound of 2 men fighting in a concrete room without light was something primal. The impact of bodies against walls, the scuff of boots on stone, the short guttural sounds of exertion and violence compressed into a space too small to contain them. Mason was a corpsman. He knew where the joints bent the wrong way. He knew where the vessels ran close to the surface. He knew what happened when you drove a thumb into the space beneath a jaw and pressed upward with everything you had. The attacker went down. Mason stood over him, breathing hard, his hands slick. The second attacker had bypassed the fight. He was in the corridor, moving toward the office. Colt saw him. The man was tall, 6'2", maybe 6'3", dressed in black tactical gear with a suppressed rifle slung across his back and a pistol in his right hand. He moved down the corridor with his weapon up and his flashlight sweeping the floor, the beam cutting through the dust and smoke like a blade. He reached the office door, tried the handle, locked. He stepped back to kick it. Colt hit him from behind like a freight train. The impact drove both of them into the opposite wall. The concrete cracked under the force. The attacker's pistol clattered across the floor. Colt pinned him against the wall with his forearm across the man's throat and his full weight behind it. The man was strong, trained. He drove an elbow into Colt's ribs once, twice, 3 times, each blow landing with precision on the same spot. Pain detonated through Colt's torso. He felt something give. He didn't let go. The attacker twisted, broke Colt's grip and threw a punch that caught him across the jaw. The world went white. Colt staggered. The man lunged for his fallen pistol. Colt grabbed him by the back of his plate carrier, hauled him backward, and drove his knee into the man's spine. The attacker buckled. Colt's fist came down on the back of his neck, once, with everything, every year, every mile. Every night spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if the woman he loved was alive or dead. Every bedtime story Rosie never heard. Every first step he never saw. Every word she ever said about the father she thought wasn't real. The man hit the floor and stayed there. Colt stood in the dark corridor with his knuckles split and his ribs screaming and blood running from a cut on his jaw. Through the office door, he could hear Rosie crying. Not screaming, but the quiet, exhausted sobs of a child who had used up every reserve of bravery and had nothing left. "It's me," he said to the door. "It's Mr. Coate. You're safe." The crying didn't stop, but it changed, shifted from terror to something softer, the sound of a child hearing a voice she trusted in the dark. From the main garage, the gunfire had changed too, less frequent, more scattered. The organized assault had fractured into pockets of resistance, as the attackers realized the building they'd expected to crack in 3 minutes had held for nearly 20, and the men inside it were not what the briefing had described. Then a new sound cut through everything, distant at first, then growing, then unmistakable. Sirens. Multiple sirens. Coming from the west on County Road 12. Coming fast. Grizzly heard it first. He was closest to the front, closest to the open air beyond the destroyed garage door. He raised his head above the tool cabinet and looked through the smoking gap. Blue and red lights, dozens of them, streaking through the snow like colored fire. County vehicles. State police. And behind them, moving in tight formation, 3 black SUVs with federal plates and roof-mounted light bars that turned the darkness into a pulsing, rhythmic declaration that the cavalry had arrived 40 minutes late and furious about it. Harper. The old sheriff had made his calls. He'd driven to the airstrip, found no plane, found no help, and instead of giving up, he'd driven to the state police barracks 40 miles west and physically walked into the building at 3 a.m. and told them everything. Everything he'd kept secret for 5 years. Everything he'd done, everything he'd hidden, every lie he'd told to protect a woman and her child. He'd burned his career, his reputation, and very possibly his freedom in a single conversation. And then he'd led them back through the storm to the building where 5 bikers were dying for the woman he'd spent half a decade trying to save. The attackers outside saw the lights. The last 2 functioning SUVs started their engines. Men scrambled from positions around the garage toward the vehicles, some running, some limping, all of them moving with the frantic, disorganized urgency of professionals who understood that the operation window had just slammed shut. One SUV made it to the road. The second didn't. A state police cruiser cut across its path at the intersection and blocked the exit. Officers poured out of vehicles. Flashlights swept the snow. Commands were shouted into the wind. Inside the garage, Colt heard it all from the corridor. He leaned against the wall with his hand pressed against his cracked ribs and listened to the sound of a world that had finally, reluctantly, decided to show up. Grizzly's voice echoed through the smoke-filled darkness. "They're running. Cops everywhere. It's over." But Colt wasn't listening to Grizzly. He was listening to the corridor behind him, to footsteps. Calm, measured footsteps approaching from the destroyed rear entrance. Someone moving through the building without urgency, without panic, stepping over debris and bodies with the unhurried confidence of a man who had planned for every contingency, including this one. Colt turned. A man stood at the end of the corridor, medium height, clean-shaven, wearing a tactical vest over a civilian jacket. No helmet, no night vision, none of the operator equipment his team carried. He held a pistol at his side, pointed at the floor, and his face was illuminated by the distant glow of emergency lights filtering through the wrecked building. He was calm, composed. His eyes moved from Colt to the office door and back with the analytical precision of someone calculating angles and outcomes with the dispassionate efficiency of a machine. "You must be Mercer," he said. Colt's shotgun was empty. His revolver was somewhere on the garage floor. He had his hands and his body and the narrow corridor and the door behind him with his daughter and her mother on the other side. "Foyle," Colt said. Warren Foyle smiled. It was a small, professional expression, the smile of a man who had long ago stopped experiencing the emotions that smiles were supposed to represent. "She told you about me." "Of course she did. Claire always talked too much. That's what made her a perfect informant and a terrible witness. She couldn't stop telling the truth. It's a disease." "Put the gun down." "You have no weapon, Mr. Mercer. I can see your hands. I can see the blood on them. You've had a very difficult night. I respect that. You fought harder than I expected, and your men—" He glanced toward the garage where the sounds of arrest and surrender were bleeding through the walls. "Your men performed admirably, but the outcome was never in question. Not really. Your team's done. Cops are everywhere. My team was always expendable. The operation has multiple layers. Even if every man I brought tonight is arrested, even if I'm arrested, the people I work for have resources that extend far beyond one tactical team in one county in one state. Claire's testimony threatens an infrastructure worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you understand what that means? It means this doesn't end tonight. It doesn't end with arrests. It ends when Claire Bennett stops being a threat, and there's only one way that happens. Foyle raised the pistol, not at Colt, past him, at the office door. "Step aside, Mr. Mercer." Colt didn't move. "I'm asking politely, which is more than anyone in my position would do. Step aside, let me finish what I came here to finish, and walk away. Take your brothers, take your wounds. Live the rest of your life knowing you fought as hard as you could, and it wasn't enough. There's no shame in that. You're going to have to go through me." Foyle studied him. The pistol remained level. Outside, the sirens were closer now, federal vehicles pulling into the property, agents shouting commands into the wind. Time was compressing around them, the window shrinking with every second. "She's not worth it," Foyle said. "Whatever you think you feel for her, whatever she told you about the daughter, about the past, about the reason she left, none of it changes the equation. She's a data point, a collection of names and dates stored in a fragile biological medium. I can name 6 people who would pay 7 figures to have that medium erased. You're standing between me and a retirement that buys a very comfortable life. So I'll ask one more time." Behind the office door, Rosie had stopped crying. The silence was absolute. Colt looked at the pistol, looked at Foyle, looked at the 10 feet of dark corridor between them. "My daughter is behind that door," Colt said. His voice was low, steady, emptied of everything except a single, irreducible fact. "And you are never going to reach her." Foyle's finger moved to the trigger. Colt charged. And from the destroyed rear entrance, a shotgun blast split the darkness, and Warren Foyle's shoulder exploded in a spray of red. Harper stood in the doorway, the Remington leveled, his face carved from stone, his uniform soaked with snow and sweat. Behind him, federal agents surged through the building. Foyle hit the wall. The pistol dropped. He slid down the concrete, clutching his shattered shoulder, his composed expression finally cracking into something raw and human and afraid. Colt stood over him. He looked down at the man who had recruited Claire, built her into a weapon, abandoned her to die, and then come to finish the job personally. The man who had turned a system designed to protect the vulnerable into a machine for eliminating them. The man who had pointed a gun at a door behind which a 4-year-old held a stuffed rabbit and waited for the noise to stop. Colt's fist was cocked. Every muscle in his body screamed to bring it down. He didn't. He turned his back on Warren Foyle, opened the office door, and dropped to his knees. Rosie launched herself off the cot and into his arms with a force that nearly knocked him backward. Her small body pressed against his chest, and her arms went around his neck, and the rabbit jammed into his collarbone, and she was shaking so hard that her teeth chattered against his shoulder. "Mr. Coate," she sobbed. "Mr. Coate, Mr. Coate, Mr. Coate." He held her. His cracked ribs screamed. Blood from his knuckles smeared across the back of his leather jacket that she was still wearing. He held her so tight that the boundary between his body and hers blurred into something that couldn't be separated by distance or time or the decisions of men in offices who had never once considered that the lives they traded in numbers had names and faces and stuffed rabbits with one button eye. Claire knelt beside them. Her arms went around both of them. She was crying, ugly, broken, gasping sobs that shook her bandaged ribs and reopened the cut on her temple. She pressed her face against Colt's neck, and her hand found the back of Rosie's head, and for 30 seconds the 3 of them existed in a space that had no room for anything else. Behind them, federal agents moved through the corridor. Foyle was being pinned down, disarmed, cuffed. Radio chatter filled the garage. Flashlight beams crossed and recrossed in the smoke. The operation was collapsing into arrest reports and evidence bags and the bureaucratic machinery that would take months to process. But in the small concrete office with no windows and a steel door, a father held his daughter for the first time, and the world outside stopped mattering entirely. The federal agents took 19 minutes to clear the building. Colt knew because he counted every one of them from the floor of the office where he sat with his back against the cot, and Rosie in his lap, and Claire pressed against his side. He counted them the way he used to count mile markers on empty highways at 3 in the morning, not because the numbers meant anything, but because counting was something his mind could do while the rest of him processed things that didn't fit into language. 19 minutes. 1,140 seconds. The length of time it took for men in windbreakers with 3-letter acronyms on the back to sweep every room, zip tie every suspect, photograph every shell casing, and established that the concrete garage on County Road 12 was no longer an active combat zone, but a crime scene. A female agent appeared in the office doorway. She was young, early 30s, dark hair pulled back, body armor over a fleece jacket. She looked at the three of them on the floor, and her expression performed the complicated recalculation that happened when a professional trained to see victims and suspects encountered something that was neither. "Sir, we need to—" "Not yet," Colt said. She looked at Claire. Claire looked back at her with an expression that communicated everything the agent needed to know about the advisability of pressing the issue. "5 minutes," the agent said, and withdrew. Rosie had stopped shaking. She sat in Colt's lap with her head against his chest and the rabbit wedged between them, and her fingers wrapped around the collar of his flannel shirt. She hadn't spoken since the shooting stopped. Her breathing had slowed to the deep, rhythmic cadence of a child whose body had decided that consciousness was no longer necessary and was pulling her towards sleep with the irresistible gravity of exhaustion. Claire's hand rested on Colt's forearm. Her grip was loose, not the white-knuckle clutch of panic, but the quiet, steady pressure of a woman who had finally stopped running and was allowing herself to feel the weight of stillness for the first time in 5 years. Blood had dried on her temple. Her bandaged ribs rose and fell with controlled, painful breaths. She stared at the opposite wall and said nothing, and the silence between them was not empty but full, loaded with years of accumulated words that would take months to speak and longer to understand. "She's asleep," Claire whispered. Colt looked down. Rosie's eyes were closed. Her mouth was slightly open. One hand still gripped his shirt. The other held the rabbit by its ear. "Yeah," he said. "Your ribs." "I know. You need a hospital." "Later." Claire turned her head and looked at him. In the dim light filtering through the office door from the agent's flashlights in the garage, her face was a landscape of damage and survival, bruised, swollen, exhausted beyond the reach of sleep, and underneath all of it, something that looked terrifyingly like peace. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't. I need to say it. You don't. Not now. Not while she's sleeping." Claire's chin trembled. She pressed her lips together and nodded once. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder and closed her eyes, and the three of them sat on the cold concrete floor of a bullet-scarred office in a ruined garage while the machinery of law enforcement dismantled the wreckage around them. They were taken to Black Hollow Medical Center in separate ambulances. Colt refused to be separated from Rosie. The paramedics looked at each other, looked at the child attached to his chest like she'd been welded there, and made the practical decision to load them together. At the hospital, the chaos was structured, the kind of organized pandemonium that emergency departments were designed to absorb. Federal agents filled the hallways. State police officers milled near the entrance. County deputies who had been pulled from their beds at 4 a.m. stood in clusters, drinking bad coffee, and trading rumors about what had happened at the Garrett property. Grizzly was in Bay 3 getting his forearm stitched. The graze was deep but clean, no tendon damage, no bone involvement. The doctor worked while Grizzly sat on the gurney with his legs hanging over the side and his boots dripping snowmelt onto the floor, looking like a mountain that someone had tried to chip with a hammer and failed. Rico was in Bay 4. The shrapnel in his thigh required minor surgery, a procedure the on-call surgeon performed with the grim efficiency of a man who had already worked a 16-hour shift and was operating on caffeine and professional obligation. Rico lay on the table with his jaw clenched and his fists wrapped in the bedsheets and didn't make a sound. When it was over, the surgeon told him he'd need crutches for 6 weeks. Rico asked for a cane instead. The surgeon didn't argue. Mason Creed sat in the waiting room with his hands in his lap, untouched. He'd walked through a firefight without a scratch, which was either extraordinary luck or the result of a combat instinct so deeply embedded that his body made survival decisions faster than his conscious mind could process them. He sat in the same plastic chair he'd occupied hours earlier and stared at the wall with an expression that gave nothing away. Deke was in Bay 2, his cracked ribs wrapped with the same elastic bandage he'd watched Mason apply to Claire earlier that night. The symmetry was not lost on him. He lay on the gurney with his arm across his eyes and breathed carefully, shallow, measured inhalations that stayed below the threshold of pain. They were battered, they were bleeding, none of them were broken. The federal agents took Claire's statement at 7 in the morning. Colt wasn't allowed in the room, but Harper, who had arrived at the hospital looking like a man who had aged a decade in 4 hours, stood outside the door and relayed what he could. Claire talked for 3 hours. She gave them everything. Every name, every date, every route, every account number, every connection between the convicted traffickers and the second network of buyers and protectors who had operated in shadow for over a decade. She reconstructed the entire architecture of the operation from memory, the same memory that Warren Foyle had spent months training her to build and years trying to destroy. The agents recorded everything. 2 of them made phone calls during breaks in the interview. One left the room and came back looking pale. Another asked Claire to repeat a specific name 3 times, as if hoping she would change her answer. She didn't. By the time she finished, the scope of the investigation had expanded from a single witness elimination to a multi-state conspiracy involving private military contractors, compromised federal employees, and a network of influential individuals whose names would eventually appear in sealed indictments that wouldn't be unsealed for months. Warren Foyle was arrested at the scene. His shattered shoulder was treated at the hospital under armed guard before he was transferred to federal custody. He said nothing during the arrest, nothing during treatment, nothing during transfer. The professional silence of a man who understood that anything he said would be used to build the case against the people who paid him, and that those people had resources to reach him even inside a federal facility. But it didn't matter anymore. Claire had talked. The information was out. The weapon Foyle had built and tried to destroy had finally been fired, and the bullet was already in flight. Harper resigned his position as sheriff of Black Hollow County 3 days later. He submitted his resignation to the county board without explanation, cleaned out his office in 20 minutes, and drove to the Iron Saints clubhouse in his personal vehicle, a 15-year-old pickup truck with a cracked windshield and a bumper sticker that said, "Protected by Smith & Wesson." He parked in the lot and sat behind the wheel for a long time before getting out. Colt was in the garage bay behind the clubhouse, working on a transmission he didn't need to work on because his hands required something to do while his mind processed the previous 72 hours. His ribs were taped, his knuckles were scabbed. He moved with the careful, deliberate slowness of a man whose body was cataloging its injuries and presenting the bill. Harper walked into the garage and stood near the workbench. Neither man spoke for 2 minutes. The sound of a socket wrench against a transmission housing filled the space between them, metallic, rhythmic, precise. "I resigned," Harper said. Colt kept working. "The board will appoint an interim. Probably Beckett. He's young, but he's clean." Socket wrench, turn, release, turn. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mercer. I don't deserve it, and I wouldn't believe it if you offered it. I'm here because—" Harper stopped. His jaw worked. The lines on his face looked deeper than they had a week ago, as if the act of finally telling the truth had released a structural tension that had been holding everything in place. "I'm here because you need to hear something from me that isn't a lie. One thing. After 5 years of lies, you deserve one honest thing." Colt set down the wrench. He didn't look up. He waited. "I made the decision to hide Claire because I believed it was the only way to keep her alive, and I still believe that. But the cost—" Harper's voice cracked. Not dramatically, just a small fracture in the gravel, like a stone splitting under pressure. "The cost was you, and I knew it. I watched you come apart for 5 years, and I told myself it was necessary. I told myself the math justified it, and maybe it did. But math doesn't account for the look on your face the night you stopped searching, and it doesn't account for a little girl who grew up thinking her father was imaginary." Colt's hands stilled on the transmission. "I can't undo it," Harper said. "I can't give you those years back, but she's here now. They're both here, and that—" He breathed. "That's the only good thing I've ever done that actually worked." Silence. The garage smelled like oil and cold metal, and the faint residual sharpness of gun smoke that would take weeks to fully leave the Saint's clothes and skin. Colt looked up. His face was unreadable, not empty, but so full of competing things that no single expression could contain them. "You saved her life last night," Colt said. "You drove 90 miles through a storm to get help when nobody answered the phone. You walked into a state police barracks and burned everything you had to bring them back in time. It was the least. It was more than the least. It was enough." Harper stared at him. "I don't forgive you," Colt said. "Maybe someday. Not today. But I'm done carrying it. I've got a daughter who needs to learn what her father looks like, and I can't do that if I'm spending every hour hating the man who kept her mother alive long enough for me to find her." Harper nodded. His eyes were wet. He blinked once, hard, and the moisture was gone, absorbed back into the weathered terrain of a face that had spent 30 years in law enforcement learning to contain things that civilians were allowed to express. He left without another word. His truck started in the parking lot. The engine faded down the county road. Colt picked up the socket wrench and went back to the transmission he didn't need to fix. Winter loosened its grip on Black Hollow County the way winter always did, reluctantly, in fits and starts, retreating a few inches each day before surging back overnight, as if testing whether anyone was still paying attention. Snow melted from rooftops during the afternoon and refroze into icicles by evening. The roads went from white to gray to black in patches that expanded like slow-moving promises. Claire and Rosie moved into the apartment above the Iron Saints clubhouse. The same apartment Colt had lived in for the past 8 years, a sparse, utilitarian space with a bed, a kitchenette, and windows that looked out over the parking lot and the feed mill's old grain silos. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't beautiful, but it had a lock on the door and a motorcycle club downstairs, and a man who slept on the couch so his daughter could have the bed. And for the first time in 5 years, Claire stopped checking the rearview mirror. Rosie adapted with the terrifying resilience of a 4-year-old who had spent her entire life in motion and had simply decided that this was the place where motion stopped. Within 3 days, she had colonized the clubhouse with the ruthless efficiency of a small invading army. Her colored pencils appeared on the bar. Her rabbit occupied a stool that no patch member dared move. Her tiny boots left prints across the concrete floor of the garage bay, tracking through oil stains and sawdust with the indiscriminate joy of a child who had discovered that the world contained buildings where people fix things instead of running from them. She followed Colt everywhere, not with the desperate, clinging attachment of a traumatized child afraid to let go, though there was some of that too in the way she checked the room for him when she woke up, in the way her face tightened for a fraction of a second when he walked toward the door. But mostly, she followed him with curiosity. The pure, relentless curiosity of a child who had been told her father rode motorcycles and was now discovering that the reality was infinitely more interesting than the story. She wanted to know what every tool did. She wanted to know why engines made noise. She wanted to know why Grizzly's beard was red and Mason's face had lines, and Deke's laugh was too loud and Rico walked with a limp now. She asked questions with the machine gun cadence of a 4-year-old who had recently discovered that adults would actually answer if you asked enough times, and she processed the answers with a seriousness that made grown men in leather vests stammer. "Why is your motorcycle black?" she asked Colt one afternoon while he changed the oil on the Road King. "Because I painted it black." "Why?" "Because I like black." "Why?" "Because it doesn't show dirt." "Mommy's car was white." "Yeah? It showed dirt." "Guess it did." Rosie considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a philosophical position. "I like black too," she announced. Then she picked up a shop rag and began wiping the motorcycle's exhaust pipe with intense concentration, smearing more oil onto the chrome than she removed. Colt watched her. Something expanded in his chest that he didn't have a name for, something too large and too unfamiliar to be processed by a man who had spent 42 years building a vocabulary for pain and isolation and had never developed the corresponding language for this. He didn't know what to call it. He didn't know what to do with it. He only knew that it was the opposite of everything he'd carried for 5 years, and it terrified him as much as it healed him. Grizzly found him on the clubhouse roof that evening, sitting on an overturned crate with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, staring at the sky where the clouds were finally breaking apart to show stars for the first time in a week. The big man lowered himself onto a ventilation unit with a grunt. His bandaged forearm rested on his knee. He pulled a cigar from his jacket, bit off the end, and lit it with a match that he struck against the sole of his boot. "She asked me to make the rabbit a vest today," Grizzly said. Colt almost smiled. Almost. "What'd you tell her?" "I told her I'd need to see the rabbit for a fitting." She handed it over and then stood there supervising the whole time like a general inspecting troops. Kid's terrifying. "She gets that from Claire." "She gets that from you." Grizzly drew on the cigar. The tip glowed orange against the darkening sky. Claire was brave. "You're terrifying. There's a difference." They sat in silence. Below them, the parking lot held 5 motorcycles lined up in a row, black and chrome catching the last light of the day. Inside the clubhouse, Rico's voice carried through an open window, telling Rosie a story about a time he got lost in Nevada and had to follow a stray dog to find his way back to the highway. Rosie's laughter drifted up through the cold air like something that had been missing from the building for years and had finally found its way home. "You doing okay?" Grizzly asked. "No?" "Good. If you said yes, I'd know you were lying." Colt took a sip of the cold coffee. It was bitter and thin. The clubhouse coffee maker produced something that was technically coffee, the way a flashlight was technically a light source. "I don't know how to be what she needs." "A father?" "Anything. I know how to ride. I know how to fight. I know how to rebuild an engine and read a road and sit with a brother in the dark, when the dark is the only thing left. None of that translates to a 4-year-old who needs someone to brush her hair and check for monsters and tell her the world is safe when we both know it isn't." Grizzly smoked in silence for a while. Below, Rosie's laughter had dissolved into the quieter sounds of evening, dishes in the kitchenette, the murmur of Claire's voice, the distant hum of the heater kicking on. "You carried her off a frozen highway in a blizzard," Grizzly said. "You gave her your jacket and sat in the cold without it. You climbed into an ambulance because she asked if you were coming. You stood in a dark corridor with no weapon and told a man with a gun that he would never reach her. And when it was over, you held her on a concrete floor until she fell asleep." He tapped ash from the cigar. It drifted down into the parking lot like gray snow. "You already know how to be what she needs. You just don't know you know it yet." Colt stared at his coffee. The surface caught the first stars appearing through the broken clouds. Tiny points of light reflected in a cup of bad coffee on a rooftop in a county that most maps forgot to label. "She called me Daddy yesterday," he said quietly. "Not Mr. Coat. Daddy. Once. Then she went back to Mr. Coat like she was testing it out and wasn't sure about the fit." Grizzly's mouth twitched beneath the beard. "Give her time. She'll land on it when she's ready." 2 weeks after the night at the Garrett property, the town of Black Hollow held a winter recovery festival. It was a small-town affair, folding tables in the community center parking lot, donated food from the 3 restaurants that had survived the economic decline, a stage made from flatbed trailers, and a sound system that had been borrowed from the high school and produced feedback every time someone stood too close to the speakers. The stated purpose was to honor the first responders and volunteers who had helped during the storm. The unstated purpose was to give a county that had been shaken by something it didn't fully understand an excuse to stand outside together and prove that it still existed. The Iron Saints arrived on their bikes. 5 Harleys rolling down Main Street in formation, Colt at the front, Grizzly on his right, Rico riding with a modified peg to accommodate his healing leg, Mason and Deke bringing up the rear. The sound of their engines echoed off the storefronts and rattled the windows of the hardware store and made the pigeons on the courthouse roof take flight in a panicked gray cloud. People watched them pass. Not the way they used to watch, with the guarded, sideways attention of citizens who had learned to avoid direct eye contact with men whose reputations preceded them like weather fronts. This time, people watched them the way you watch something you're seeing clearly for the first time. A woman outside the bakery nodded. A man in a feed cap raised his coffee cup. A teenager sitting on the curb with his phone actually looked up. They parked at the edge of the festival and killed their engines. Claire was already there, sitting at a table near the stage with a cup of hot cider and a look on her face that Colt was beginning to recognize as the expression of a woman slowly, carefully, allowing herself to believe that the ground beneath her feet was solid. Her bruises had faded to yellow-green. She moved without wincing now, though she still held her left arm close to her body in a protective gesture that would probably outlast the injury by months. Rosie stood on the stage. She had gotten up there through a combination of charm, determination, and the assistance of a county deputy named Beckett, Harper's interim replacement, who had lifted her onto the flatbed when she announced that she wanted to see everything and the ground was too short. She stood at the microphone with the complete, unearned confidence of a child who had not yet learned that public speaking was supposed to be frightening. She wore the leather jacket, Colt's jacket. The thing was so large on her that it hung past her knees, and the sleeves had been rolled up 6 times. She looked like a small person wearing a tent made of leather and attitude. The pendant hung around her neck, catching the late afternoon sun. She scanned the crowd with those enormous brown eyes until she found him. Standing at the back, near the bikes, with his arms crossed and his face doing the complicated thing it always did when emotion arrived in quantities his expression couldn't accommodate. Rosie pointed at him. "That's my daddy," she said into the microphone. Her voice was thin and clear and carried across the parking lot with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old who had made a decision and was informing the world. The microphone squealed with feedback. Nobody cared. The crowd turned. 200 people looked at Colt Mercer, the man most of them had spent years crossing the street to avoid, the man whose reputation was built on silence and violence and the unspoken understanding that he existed outside the boundaries of their comfortable world. And something shifted. Not dramatically, not with applause or tears or the cinematic catharsis of a crowd suddenly recognizing a hero in their midst. It shifted the way real things shift, slowly, awkwardly, with the uncertain self-conscious adjustment of people revising an opinion they'd held for so long it had become structural. A few people clapped, then more, then most of them. Colt didn't move. He stood at the back of the crowd with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, and his eyes locked on the small figure on the stage, who was now holding up the angel pendant for everyone to see. "And these bikers saved us," Rosie announced. Grizzly cleared his throat beside him. Rico looked at the sky. Mason examined his hands. Deke suddenly found something fascinating about the toe of his boot. 5 men who had been shot at, beaten, cut, and cracked, standing in a parking lot trying not to fall apart because a 4-year-old called them heroes into a borrowed microphone. Claire appeared beside Colt. She didn't say anything. She slipped her hand into his and interlaced their fingers and stood with him while the crowd clapped and Rosie waved from the stage with the royal enthusiasm of a child who had discovered that attention was a renewable resource. "She practiced that," Claire said. "What?" "The pointing, the announcement. She practiced in front of the bathroom mirror 3 times this morning. She wanted to get the words right." Colt looked at Claire. The late sun hit her face at an angle that softened the remaining bruises and caught the edges of her hair. Growing out now, the dye fading, the original color returning in streaks of warm brown that he remembered from a different life. She was watching Rosie with an expression that held everything she'd been denied for 5 years. The simple, unbearable joy of watching her daughter exist in a place where no one was hunting them. "She called me Daddy," Colt said. "I heard. Not Mr. Coat." "I know." Claire squeezed his hand. "She's been practicing that too." Snow began to fall again, soft this time. Not the horizontal, blinding assault of the storm, but a gentle, vertical descent that made the world look like it was being slowly wrapped in something quiet and clean. Flakes landed on the leather jacket draped over Rosie's shoulders and melted on contact with the sun-warmed leather. The festival continued around them. People ate, people talked. A high school kid played guitar on the stage after Rosie was gently persuaded to surrender the microphone. The sound system still gave feedback. The coffee from the community center was terrible. A dog got loose and stole a plate of brisket from an unattended table, and nobody could catch it because it was faster and more motivated than anyone there. Normal life. Ordinary chaos. The unremarkable machinery of a small town doing what small towns do when the crisis passes, and the only thing left is the business of going on. Colt stood in the middle of it and felt the strangeness of belonging somewhere. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't natural. It sat on him like a garment cut for a different body, too tight in the places where he'd built walls and too loose in the places where the walls had been torn down. But it was there. It was real. And for the first time in longer than he could calculate, the road in front of him didn't lead away from something. It just led home. That evening, after the festival, after the long ride back to the clubhouse, after Rosie's bath and Rosie's bedtime story, told by Grizzly, because Grizzly had somehow become the club's unofficial narrator of rabbit-related adventure tales, and took the responsibility with a solemnity that bordered on sacred, Colt sat on the steps outside the clubhouse with a cup of coffee and listened to the world settle into night. The parking lot was empty except for the 5 bikes lined up under the overhang. Ice had begun to form on their chrome exhaust pipes. The sky was clear for the first time in weeks, and the stars over Black Hollow County were so thick and bright they looked like a crack in the darkness, letting something through from the other side. The door opened behind him. Footsteps. Small ones. Rosie sat down beside him on the step. She was wearing pajamas with rockets on them and the leather jacket over top, because the jacket had become a non-negotiable element of her wardrobe that no amount of reasoning could dislodge. The rabbit sat in her lap. The pendant caught the porch light. "Daddy," she said. Not Mr. Coat. "Yeah, baby." "The stars are loud tonight." He looked at her. "Loud?" "Mommy says when there's lots of stars, it means the sky is talking." "Is the sky talking?" Colt looked up. The stars burned in silence across a universe that had no opinion about the things that happened beneath it, the violence, the loss, the years stolen and the years recovered, the impossible mathematics of a man finding his daughter on a frozen highway because he happened to be riding through a storm he had no reason to be in. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." "What's it saying?" Colt put his arm around her. She leaned into his side, warm, solid, real. The rabbit's remaining button eye stared up at the sky with the serene, unblinking acceptance of a thing that had been through everything and come out the other side with its stuffing intact. "It's saying goodnight," Colt told her. Rosie considered this, nodded once with the decisive authority of someone who had evaluated the claim and found it satisfactory. "Good night, Sky," she said. Then she pressed her face into the leather jacket that smelled like engine oil and cold iron and the particular irreplaceable scent of the man who wore it, and she closed her eyes. Colt held his daughter on the steps of the clubhouse and watched the stars over Black Hollow County, and understood, finally, with the clarity that comes only after everything has been lost and something impossible has been given back, that the road had never been taking things from him. It had been bringing him here. He just hadn't known where here was until a little girl stood in the middle of a frozen highway and asked if her mommy had sent him. Nobody sent him. He was just riding through the storm, and the storm brought him home.